Tonight, we're exploring every major battle in the Dance of the Dragons. This is one of those topics with more beneath the surface, but I'll keep the tone calm so you can relax into the story. Thank you to those of you who've been joining us consistently. If you're falling asleep with us tonight, let me know in the comments how many nights in a row you've been here. And if this is your first night, just comment night 1. Now back to the video. King Viserys I had spent years insisting that his daughter, Rhaenyra Targaryen, would succeed him on the Iron Throne. Lords of the realm had sworn to honor her claim. Yet when the king died in the year 129, after the conquest, his body was kept hidden while a small group of his advisors met behind closed doors in King's Landing. This was the Green Council, led by those who believed Viserys' eldest son, Aegon, should rule instead. They moved quietly, but not gently. Ravens were delayed. Doors were watched. Aegon himself had to be found and persuaded to accept a crown he had never expected to wear. Soon, in the Dragonpit, Aegon II was crowned, before a gathering of cheering citizens and armored knights. The crown placed upon his head had belonged to Aegon the Conqueror. Beside him stood his mother, Alicent Hightower, and Sir Criston Cole, the Lord Commander of the Kingsguard. Above them all loomed the memory of dragons, for the Targaryens had ruled Westeros through fire and fear for more than a century. Across the narrow water on Dragonstone, Rhaenyra received word that her father was dead and her throne had been taken. Grief and anger struck at nearly the same moment. She was crowned there, not with the conqueror's crown, but with the crown of her father, Viserys. Two rulers now claimed the same kingdom. Two courts sent ravens to the great houses, and more dangerously, both sides possessed dragons. The first true bloodshed did not come from a great host meeting another upon an open field. It came from an envoy, a castle, and a storm-darkened sky. Rhaenyra sent her son Lucerys Velaryon to Storm's End. Luke was young, slight, and still learning what it meant to carry the expectations of a royal family. His dragon, Arax, was young as well, pale and swift, but small beside the ancient beasts of the Targaryen line. At Storm's End, Lucerys found that he was not the first prince to arrive. Aemond Targaryen, Aegon's younger brother, had already come on Vhagar. Vhagar was the oldest and largest living dragon in the world, a creature who had once carried Queen Visenya during the conquest. Her wings were vast, her scales dark, and her rider was a prince with one missing eye and a long memory. Aemond had not forgotten the childhood fight in which Lucerys took that eye. In the great hall of Storm's End, he demanded repayment. Lucerys refused. Lord Boros Baratheon would not permit bloodshed beneath his roof, so the boy prince was allowed to leave. Outside, however, the rain came hard across Shipbreaker Bay. Lightning flashed over the sea. Arax rose into the clouds, trying to carry Lucerys home to Dragonstone. Behind them came Vhagar, enormous enough to seem less like a dragon than a moving piece of the storm itself. What happened in those clouds became one of the defining moments of the war. Whether Aemond meant only to frighten Lucerys, or whether he intended murder from the beginning, has been debated ever since. Arax snapped at Vhagar in panic. Vhagar answered with one terrible attack. By morning, fragments of Arax and Lucerys had washed upon the shores below Storm's End. The war had begun in earnest. It would spread from the Stormlands into the Riverlands, across the narrow sea, through the streets of King's Landing, and into skies where dragons tore at one another, above ancient castles and black water. But on that night, beneath the thunder, the first great loss belonged to Rhaenyra's side. King Viserys I took the Iron Throne in the year 103 after the conquest. He was not the obvious choice. The Great Council of Harrenhal had passed over the claims of Rhaenys Targaryen and her line, settling instead on Viserys, a grandson of Jaehaerys the Old King. That decision, made by a gathering of lords, set a precedent that would later be twisted into justification for war. But in those early years, Viserys seemed exactly what the realm needed. He was generous, courteous, and eager to maintain the peace his grandfather had built. He loved feasts, tourneys, and the quiet rituals of court. He was not a warrior king, but he did not need to be. The Targaryens had dragons. By the time Viserys sat the throne, House Targaryen possessed more dragons than any generation before them. Vhagar, the great she-dragon of the conquest, still lived, ancient and vast. Caraxes, the bloodworm, was in the prime of his ferocity. Syrax, golden and sleek, belonged to Viserys' daughter Rhaenyra. There were others besides, young and old, nesting on Dragonstone and in the Dragonpit of King's Landing. The sight of dragons wheeling above the city was so common that small folk barely looked up. The Targaryens had ruled for more than a century through fire and blood, but also through the simple, overwhelming fact that no army could stand against them. That power seemed eternal. It was not. The peace Viserys presided over was real. Harvests were good. Trade flowed from the free cities to the ports of the Crownlands. The great houses bickered but did not rebel. The king's small council managed the realm with competence, and the king himself was beloved for his easy manner. But beneath that calm, a question had been planted. Viserys had no living son from his first wife, Aemma Arryn. She died giving birth to a boy who lived only a single day. That loss shaped everything that followed. The king remarried, choosing Alicent Hightower, the daughter of his hand, Otto Hightower. She gave him sons, Aegon, Aemond, Daemon. And yet Viserys refused to set aside his firstborn daughter. He named Rhaenyra his heir when she was still a child, and he made the lords of Westeros swear oaths to her. Those oaths were given freely, but they were given in a time of peace, when the succession seemed a distant abstraction. The court divided quietly. On one side stood Rhaenyra, fierce and proud, married to Laenor Velaryon, in a match meant to bind the two great dragon-riding houses. On the other stood Queen Alicent, who saw her own sons pushed aside. The king did little to resolve the tension. He loved his daughter, but he also loved his younger children. He allowed both factions to grow strong within the Red Keep, believing that his authority would hold them together. It did, as long as he lived. But the realm was not built on trust. It was built on dragons and uneasy compromise. The great houses had sworn to Rhaenyra, but many had also married into the Hightower network. The Velaryons controlled the seas. The Lannisters and Baratheons watched and waited. Every lord understood that the moment Viserys died, the oaths would be tested. The king himself seemed to sense the fragility. He grew ill in his later years, his body wasting, his face half hidden by the golden mask he wore to hide the rot. He held court from a wheeled chair, but he still insisted that Rhaenyra would succeed him. He sent ravens reaffirming her position. He ignored the whispers that his son Aegon was being groomed for the throne by the queen and her father. Viserys was not blind, but he was tired. He had spent decades balancing factions, smoothing tensions, and pretending that the realm's unity was stronger than the ambitions of the men and women around him. He was wrong. The Targaryens had more dragons than ever, and they mistook that overwhelming power for lasting stability. They did not see that dragons were not a guarantee of peace. They were weapons, and weapons could be turned against each other. The great beasts had never fought one another in earnest since the days of the conquest, when Vhagar and Meraxes had burned the armies of the Reach. But that was against enemies, not against kin. No one had thought to ask what would happen when dragon met dragon in a war between two branches of the same family. The answer would come soon enough. In the final years of Viserys' reign, the court at King's Landing was a place of careful smiles and hidden daggers. Rhaenyra had moved to Dragonstone, partly to avoid the tension, partly to secure her own base. There she gathered her own council, her own loyalists. Her husband Daemon, the king's brother, was a man of restless ambition and sharp steel. He had been passed over for the throne himself, but he had found a new path through his marriage to Rhaenyra. Together, they raised their children, trained their dragons, and watched the horizon. Across the bay, in the Red Keep, Queen Alicent raised her own sons. Aegon was sullen and reluctant. Aemond was sharp and hungry. Daemon was sent to Old Town to be fostered. The pieces were set. When Viserys finally died, in the 129th year after the conquest, the realm did not shatter immediately. It held its breath. The Green Council moved in the shadows, and the crown was placed on Aegon II's head before the news even reached Dragonstone. But the peace that Viserys had built was already gone. It had been gone for years, hidden beneath ceremony and courtesy. The question of succession had never been answered. It had only been postponed. And now the postponement was over. The dragons would decide. The peace that Viserys had maintained for so long was built on a delicate balance, but the question of succession was never truly settled. Then came the death of his son Balon. Balon had been the king's second son, born to his second wife, Alicent Hightower, and for a time he had been the heir apparent, the Prince of Dragonstone. But the boy died in his infancy, a fever taking him before he could even learn to ride a dragon. And so Viserys was left with only one child from his first marriage to Arthema Arryn, a daughter, Rhaenyra. And from his second marriage, he had other children, but they were younger, and the law of the Seven Kingdoms had never been clear on whether a daughter could inherit before a son. Viserys made his choice. He summoned the lords of the realm to the Red Keep, and there, in the Great Hall, he named Rhaenyra his heir. He gave her the title Princess of Dragonstone, the traditional seat of the Targaryen heir, and one by one, the great lords of Westeros knelt before her and swore solemn oaths to uphold her right to succeed her father. They placed their hands on the Iron Throne and pledged their fealty to the princess. It was a grand ceremony, full of pageantry and the weight of history. The decision seemed final at the time. The realm accepted it, or at least gave no sign of dissent. Rhaenyra was young, but she was Dragon Rider, and she had the blood of old Valyria. It seemed that the succession was settled, yet every future marriage and birth slowly weakened its certainty. Viserys remarried, and his new wife Alicent gave him sons, Aegon, Aemond, and Daemon. As these boys grew, the court began to whisper, a son, after all, was the natural heir in the eyes of many. And Rhaenyra herself married, first to Laenor Velaryon, and then to her uncle Daemon. She had children of her own, but their legitimacy was questioned, especially those from her first marriage. The oaths that had been sworn began to feel like old parchment, brittle and easily forgotten. The king grew older, and the factions around him hardened. The Greens, led by Queen Alicent and her father Ser Otto Hightower, quietly prepared for a different future, and the Blacks, loyal to Rhaenyra, watched with growing unease. The seeds of conflict were quietly sown, waiting for the moment when they would finally take root. And that moment would come when the king's breath finally left him, and the question of who would sit the Iron Throne could no longer be ignored. And so it was. When King Viserys I died in his sleep, in the 129th year after Aegon's conquest, the realm did not wait for mourning. The Greens moved swiftly. Within hours of the king's passing, Queen Alicent and Ser Otto Hightower had secured the Red Keep. They summoned the small council, and though the Lord Commander of the Kingsguard, Sir Harold Westerling, protested, they crowned Aegon the Elder in the Dragonpit before the sun had set. The bells of King's Landing rang out, not for the dead king, but for the new one. Aegon II, they called him, though he had never been named heir by his father. Across the narrow sea, on Dragonstone, Rhaenyra received the news from a raven that arrived just as she was about to give birth to yet another child. The labor was difficult, and the child was stillborn. When she learned that her half-brother had taken the throne she had been promised, she wept, but not for long. She had dragons, and she had allies. Her uncle husband Daemon Targaryen urged her to strike immediately, to fly to King's Landing and burn the Red Keep to ash. But Rhaenyra was more cautious. She sent ravens to the great houses, reminding them of their oaths. Some answered. The North, the Riverlands, the Vale, and parts of the Reach declared for her. But the Westerlands, the Stormlands, and the Crownlands sided with Aegon. The realm split in two. Thus began the war they would later call the Dance of the Dragons. It was not a war of armies alone, but of dragons against dragons. The first blood was drawn at a place called Rook's Rest, where the Greens ambushed Rhaenyra's forces. Her husband Daemon and her son Jacaerys flew into battle, but the Greens had brought Vhagar, the largest living dragon, ridden by Aemond One-Eye. The battle was a slaughter. Rhaenyra's dragon Syrax was wounded, and Jacaerys fell from the sky, burned alive. Daemon barely escaped. The war grew more savage with each passing moon. Rhaenyra eventually took King's Landing, but her rule was short and bitter. She sat the Iron Throne, but the throne itself cut her, as if it rejected her. The people of the city, who had once cheered for her, turned against her when she raised taxes to pay for the war. And then came the storming of the Dragonpit, when the mob of King's Landing, driven mad by fear and hunger, rose up and killed the dragons chained within. 4 dragons died that day, including Rhaenyra's own Syrax. The Targaryen power was broken. In the end, it was betrayal that sealed her fate. She fled the city, but her own half-brother Aegon II, who had been hiding in the Reach, returned with a new army. Rhaenyra was captured at Dragonstone, and Aegon fed her to his dragon, Sunfire. She was only 33 years old. The war did not end with her death. It dragged on for another year, until Aegon himself was poisoned by his own men, and then the throne passed to Rhaenyra's son, Aegon III, a boy of 10, who had watched his mother's dragon die and had been a prisoner of the Greens. He was called the Dragonbane, for under his rule, the last of the great dragons perished. The Targaryen dynasty survived, but it was forever changed. The Dance of the Dragons had consumed the very creatures that had made them gods among men, and the scars of that war would never fully heal. For years, the realm had accepted Rhaenyra as the heir. Lords from every corner of Westeros had knelt before the Iron Throne and sworn their oaths to uphold her claim. But oaths, as history would prove, are only as strong as the will to keep them. King Viserys I had ruled for nearly 2 decades by the time his first wife, Aemond Arryn, died. He had no surviving sons, only Rhaenyra. The court expected him to remarry, to try again for a male heir, and so he did. The woman he chose was Alicent Hightower, the daughter of his hand, Otto Hightower. She was young, barely more than a girl when she came to court, and she had grown up in the Red Keep, close to the royal family. Her father was a man of deep ambition, a second son of Oldtown, who had risen to the highest office in the realm through cunning and patience. He saw in his daughter a path to lasting power. The marriage was announced in the 106th year after the conquest. Viserys was past 40, his health already beginning to fray. Alicent was 18. The wedding was a grand affair, but beneath the silk and gold, a quiet unease settled over the court. Rhaenyra, who had been the only child of the king for so long, now had a stepmother only a few years older than herself, and soon Alicent proved fertile. She gave Viserys a son, Aegon, named for the conqueror, then another son, Aemond, then a daughter, Helaena. The line of succession, once so clear, now had a new branch. The birth of Aegon changed everything. He was a boy, and in the traditions of the 7 kingdoms, a son came before a daughter. But Viserys had already named Rhaenyra his heir, and the lords had sworn. The king refused to alter his decision. He insisted that Rhaenyra would follow him, that Aegon would serve as her heir in turn. But the seeds of doubt had been planted. Otto Hightower, ever the patient schemer, began to cultivate a faction around his grandson. He whispered to lords, who valued tradition over royal decree. He reminded them that the Great Council of 101 had chosen a male claimant over a female one, even if that male was a distant cousin. Why should the throne pass to a woman when a true-born son lived? At first, the tension was subtle. It showed in the way courtiers dressed. Alicent and her ladies began to wear green, the colour of House Hightower, at court functions. Rhaenyra and her supporters, in turn, wore black, the colour of House Targaryen. What started as a matter of fashion became a badge of allegiance. The Greens and the Blacks, two factions, each gathering strength, each watching the other with cold, calculating eyes. The court of King Viserys became a place of polite smiles and whispered conspiracies. Every feast, every council meeting, every royal progress was a stage for this quiet war. Rhaenyra married Laenor Velaryon, a match meant to strengthen her position, but it brought its own complications. She had children, but their paternity was questioned. Meanwhile, Alicent's sons grew strong and bold. Aegon, the eldest, was sullen and given to drink. Aemond was sharp, fierce, and hungry for recognition. The rivalry between the two families deepened. When Viserys grew older and more ill, the question of succession could no longer be ignored. The king tried to hold the realm together by force of will, but his body failed him, and when he finally died, in the 129th year after the conquest, the Greens moved quickly. They crowned Aegon II in the Red Keep, before word of Viserys' death could even reach Dragonstone. Rhaenyra, who had been waiting for her father's passing, learned of the usurpation from a raven. The realm now had two monarchs, and the dance of the dragons had begun. What had started as cold etiquette, as the colour of a gown or the tilt of a crown, had hardened into a dynastic rivalry that neither side could peacefully contain. The Greens controlled the capital, the treasury, and the largest dragon in the world, Vhagar, ridden by Aemond. The Blacks held Dragonstone, the ancestral seat of House Targaryen, and the loyalty of several powerful houses. But both sides knew that words and oaths would soon give way to fire and blood. The first blow would not be struck in a throne room. It would come in the stormy skies above a castle on the coast, where two young princes met, and the war truly began. The previous chapter left us with King Viserys I, remarrying Alicent Hightower, the daughter of his hand, Otto Hightower. Alicent bore him sons, beginning with Aegon, and then Aemond and Daemon. These boys grew up in the Red Keep alongside Rhaenyra's own children, but the court was already splitting into two camps, divided by ambition, blood, and the unspoken question of who would one day sit the Iron Throne. Rhaenyra had married Sir Laenor Velaryon, a match meant to strengthen her claim and bind the great seafaring house to her cause. The marriage produced three sons, Jacaerys, Lucerys, and Joffrey. They were presented to the realm as Velaryons, with the silver-gold hair of their mother and the sea-green eyes of their father's house. But the court whispered. The boys had brown hair, dark eyes, and features that resembled none of Laenor's kin. Everyone knew the truth, though no one dared speak it aloud. The father was said to be Sir Harwin Strong, the heir to Harrenhal, and a sworn shield to the princess. The rumours grew so loud that even Viserys himself had to issue a decree forbidding any mention of the children's parentage, on pain of losing a tongue. Yet the stain remained. To the Greens, the boys were bastards, and that made Rhaenyra's claim even more fragile. While Rhaenyra's sons grew up under the shadow of doubt, Alicent's children flourished in the light of the throne. Aegon, the firstborn, was given a dragon egg that hatched into Sunfire, a golden beast of terrible beauty. Aemond, the second son, was smaller and more intense, driven by a hunger for recognition. For years he had no dragon, and that lack burned inside him. Daemon, the youngest, was sent to Old Town as a ward, and there claimed the blue dragon Tessarion. And then there was Helaena, the only daughter, gentle and strange, who rode the dragon Dreamfire. Each of Alicent's children became a dragon rider, and each dragon became a symbol of their house's power. But the most dramatic addition to the Green's strength came from an unexpected source. Aemond, still dragonless at 10 years old, decided to claim the largest dragon alive. Vhagar had once belonged to Viserys's brother, the late Prince Daemon's first wife, Rhea Royce, and then to Laena Velaryon. After Laena's death, the ancient she-dragon had been left riderless at Driftmark. Aemond slipped out one night, climbed the beast, and returned to the castle with Vhagar's loyalty, sealed in blood and fire. The act earned him a scar and a nickname, Aemond One-Eye, after a brawl with Rhaenyra's sons that cost him an eye. It also earned him the Green's most terrifying weapon. Vhagar was the largest dragon in the world, a living engine of war, and she answered to a boy who had no patience for peace. Meanwhile, Rhaenyra's own strength grew in a different way. Daemon Targaryen, her uncle and former suitor, had been exiled from court for years. He had fought in the Stepstones, claimed the title King of the Narrow Sea, and married Laena Velaryon, with whom he had 2 daughters, Baela and Rhaena. After Lana's death, Daemon returned to Rhaenyra's side. He was older now, seasoned by war, and he brought with him the enormous blood-red dragon Caraxes, a beast as fierce and cunning as its rider. Daemon and Rhaenyra married in a secret ceremony, and he became her most formidable commander, her husband, and the father of her future children. His presence hardened the Blacks. He was not a man of oaths and councils. He was a man of action, and he saw the coming war as inevitable. The royal family was no longer a single household. It was an armed camp. Every child of any significance had a dragon. Rhaenyra's sons rode Vermax, Arax, and Taraxes. Daemon's daughters, Baela and Rhaena, claimed Moondancer and a dragon yet unnamed. The Greens had Sunfire, Vhagar, Dreamfire, and Tessarion. Even the youngest children, like Rhaenyra's son Aegon the Younger, would one day bond with the dragon Stormcloud. The dragons were everywhere, and they were growing restless. The courtiers of King's Landing could feel it. The air was thick with the smell of smoke and the distant rumble of wings. And yet, for all the tension, Viserys held the realm together by sheer will. He was old, sick, and weary, but he refused to see the cracks. He believed that his word as king was enough, that the oaths sworn to Rhaenyra would hold. But the Greens were already building their own alliances. Alicent's father, Otto Hightower, had been dismissed as Hand but remained a powerful voice. Criston Cole, the Lord Commander of the Kingsguard, was fiercely loyal to Alicent and her sons. They whispered to Aegon, reminding him that the throne had never passed to a woman, that the realm would never accept a bastard queen, that the crown was his by right. The children of the 2 families grew up together in the same castle, but they were strangers to each other. Rhaenyra's boys knew they were not safe. Aemond's scar was a constant reminder of the hatred between them, and when Viserys finally died, the fragile peace would shatter. The dragons would not wait. They would take to the skies, and the first blood would be drawn not on a battlefield, but in the stormy skies above Shipbreaker Bay, where a young prince and his dragon would meet a fate that no one could undo. The years of quiet tension between the 2 branches of House Targaryen had not yet broken into open war, but the seeds were already deep in the soil. Rhaenyra's children, presented as Velaryons, carried the name of the Sea Snake's house, but their true parentage was an open secret whispered in every corridor of the Red Keep. The boys, Jacaerys, Lucerys and Joffrey, had brown hair and brown eyes, the unmistakable mark of their father, Sir Harwin Strong, and though no one dared speak it aloud in the presence of the king, the court knew, Alicent Hightower knew, her children knew, and that knowledge festered. Alicent's sons grew into dragon riders, with their own claims, their own grievances, and their own loyal companions of scale and flame. Aegon the eldest rode Sunfire, a dragon of golden beauty. Elena, the only daughter, rode Dreamfire, a pale blue queen of the skies. And Aemond, the second son, the sharp-toothed boy, who had long been overshadowed by his elder brother, burned with a hunger for a dragon worthy of his ambition. He had tried to claim a hatchling in the Dragonpit, but no egg would quicken for him. He had watched his siblings mount their dragons, while he remained earthbound, and the shame of it carved a hollow in him that only fire could fill. Then came the funeral at Driftmark. Rhaenyra Velaryon, daughter of Corlys and Rhaenys, wife of Prince Daemon Targaryen, had died in a tragic birthing bed on the island of Pentos. Her body was put to the sea, and the great houses of the realm gathered on the shores of Driftmark to honour her. The night was heavy with salt and grief. Torches flickered along the cliffs, and in the darkness, something stirred that would change the course of the war before it had even begun. Vhagar, the largest living dragon in all of Westeros, had come to the funeral. She was the mount of Rhaenyra Velaryon, and now she was riderless. Vhagar was a relic of the conquest, a beast born in the dawn of the Targaryen dynasty, a creature so vast that her wings could cast shadows over entire villages. She had carried Queen Visenya into battle, and later Balon the Brave, and then Rhaenyra. Now she sat alone on the beach, a mountain of bronze and green, her eyes like molten gold, waiting. Young Aemond Targaryen, barely 10 years old, saw his chance. While the adults mourned and the other children slept, he crept out of the castle, down to the shoreline, and approached the ancient dragon. It was a fool's errand, a death wish, a moment of pure, reckless courage. But Aemond had nothing to lose and everything to prove. He spoke to Vhagar in High Valyrian, the old tongue of the Dragon Lords, and the beast lowered her head. He climbed onto her back, and when the sun rose the next morning, Aemond Targaryen was a dragon rider. The triumph was absolute. For the first time in his life, Aemond had something that no one could take from him. He had the largest dragon in the world. He had power, but the joy was short-lived. Later that day, the children of the two rival factions met in the courtyard of High Tide. Rhaenyra's sons, Jacaerys, Lucerys and Joffrey, were there along with Daemon's daughters, Baela and Rhaena. Baela, the elder twin, had been betrothed to Lucerys. Rhaena, the younger, had been promised to a dragon egg that never hatched. And now Aemond, the Green Prince, the son of Alicent, had claimed the dragon that had belonged to their mother. The confrontation was inevitable. Words were exchanged. Accusations flew. Aemond, emboldened by his new mount, taunted the boys about their parentage. He called them Strongs, not Velaryons, and he mocked Rhaena for being dragonless. The insults struck deep. Jacaerys drew his blade. Lucerys, younger and quicker, grabbed a rock, and then the fight turned savage. In the chaos, Aemond struck Baela, and Lucerys lunged forward. The rock caught Aemond across the face, a brutal accidental blow that sliced open his left eye. Blood poured down his cheek. He screamed. The children scattered. When the adults arrived, they found Aemond on the ground, clutching his ruined eye, and the truth of what had happened began to unravel. King Viserys, old and weary, tried to broker peace. He demanded that the children reconcile, that the matter be buried, but Alicent would not let it go. She demanded justice, demanded that Lucerys lose an eye in return. Viserys refused. The king's word was law, but the wound in Aemond's face was deeper than flesh. It was a wound to his pride, to his honour, to his very identity. And from that day forward, Aemond Targaryen carried a scar and a hatred that would outlast kingdoms. He had lost an eye, but he had gained Vhagar, and with Vhagar, he had gained a lifelong hunger for revenge. The boy who had been mocked, overlooked, and underestimated now had the means to destroy his enemies. He would wait, he would watch, and when the time came, he would make Lucerys Velaryon pay. The future war acquired its most dangerous dragon rider long before the first banners were raised. Aemond One Eye, as he would come to be known, was a weapon forged in childhood violence, tempered by humiliation, and armed with the largest dragon the world had ever seen. The dance of the dragons would not begin for several more years, but its most fearsome champion was already an Ambriaite in place, riding the beast that had once carried the Conqueror's sister, and so the stage was set. The succession crisis still simmered beneath the surface of the court, but now there was a new element. A prince with a scarred face and a dragon that could burn cities. The next move would come from the sea, from a storm, and from a boy who would never see the sun again. The previous chapter ended with a violent confrontation at Driftmark, where young Aemond Targaryen claimed Vorgar, the largest living dragon in the world, and lost an eye in the brawl that followed. That night set the stage for everything that came next, because it hardened the divisions within the royal family into something irreversible. King Viserys, frail and exhausted, tried to mend the wounds with words and commands, but the damage was already done. The Queen, Alicent Hightower, now saw Rhaenyra's children as a direct threat to her own, and the king, for all his love of peace, could not bring himself to name a new heir or to force a definitive resolution. And so the years passed. Viserys grew weaker, his body ravaged by the slow decay of his flesh. He spent more time in his chambers, attended by maesters and by Alicent, who controlled access to him. The realm knew he was dying, but no one knew exactly when the end would come. And the king, in his final months, seemed to drift between moments of clarity and long stretches of fevered sleep. He spoke often of the prophecy of Aegon the Conqueror, the Song of Ice and Fire, and he repeated to Alicent that Rhaenyra was the chosen one, the prince that was promised. But Alicent, in her own mind, heard something different. She believed the king had spoken of their son Aegon, the firstborn male. Whether she misunderstood deliberately or through genuine confusion, history does not say. But that misunderstanding would become the spark that lit the fire. In the year 129 after Aegon's conquest, King Viserys Targaryen died in his bed. He was 52 years old, and he left behind a kingdom that was already split in two. He had spent 2 decades avoiding the choice between his daughter and his son, hoping that time would somehow resolve the conflict. But time had only deepened the rift, and now with his death there was no solution, no clear decree, no final word that could silence the competing claims. The realm was a tinderbox, and the king had simply stopped breathing. But the Greens did not wait for morning. Alicent Hightower, her father Otto, and the Lord Commander of the Kingsguard, Sir Criston Cole, acted within hours. They sealed the Red Keep. They locked the doors to the Tower of the Hand and to the royal apartments. They did not announce the king's death. Instead, they sent word only to those they trusted. The Queen's men moved silently through the corridors of power, and the first thing they secured was the treasury. Gold was the sinew of war, and they knew that control of the crown's wealth would give them leverage over the great houses. Next came the City Watch, the Gold Cloaks. Their commander was a man named Luther Largent, but the real authority behind them was Sir Criston Cole, who had spent years cultivating loyalty among the men who patrolled King's Landing. The Gold Cloaks were given new orders: close the gates, watch the streets, and arrest anyone who spoke of the king's death before the council was ready. The city fell silent under a blanket of controlled information. Then the council took hostages. The most valuable prisoners were the children of Rhaenyra and Daemon, who remained in the capital. Rhaenyra's sons by line of Velaryon, Jacaerys and Lucerys, were not in King's Landing, but her youngest, the boy named Viserys, was there, along with Daemon's daughters Baela and Rhaena. They were not harmed, but they were watched. They were leverage, and the Greens intended to use them. And then, in a locked chamber beneath the Red Keep, the Green Council met. Otto Hightower presided. Alicent sat beside him. Criston Cole stood at the door. The Grand Maester Orwyle was there, along with Lord Jasper Wilde and Sir Tylan Lannister, the Master of Coin. They debated for hours. Some urged caution, suggesting that Rhaenyra be allowed to bend the knee, that a compromise could still be found. But Otto Hightower had been planning this moment for years. He argued that the only way to secure the realm was to crown Aegon, the king's firstborn son, and to do it before Rhaenyra could gather her forces. The succession was no longer a legal dispute. In that locked chamber, it became a planned coup. The doors were closed, and the decision was made. They sent ravens to the great houses, but the messages were carefully worded. They announced the king's death and the accession of Aegon II. But they did not mention Rhaenyra's claim. They assumed that most lords would accept the fait accompli, that the weight of the Iron Throne would crush any opposition. But they underestimated the loyalty that Rhaenyra had built over 2 decades. They underestimated the power of the oaths sworn to her, and they underestimated the dragons that would soon take to the sky. The Green Council moved quickly, but they could not move silently forever. Word of the king's death would leak. Rhaenyra would learn the truth, and when she did, the realm would have 2 monarchs, and the dance of the dragons would begin. The first blood had already been shed at Driftmark. The next would be spilled in the stormy skies above Shipbreaker Bay. The king is dead, but the realm does not yet know it. In the hours after Viserys I drew his last breath, the Red Keep became a fortress of whispers and closed doors. The Green Council moved with a precision that spoke of long preparation. They had spent years planning for this moment, and now that it had arrived, there was no room for hesitation. The first task was to find Aegon II, the eldest son of the late king, and convince him to take the crown he had never truly wanted. Aegon was not in his chambers, nor in the throne room, nor in the training yards where he sometimes passed the hours. His mother, Queen Alicent, and Sir Criston Cole, the Lord Commander of the Kingsguard, searched the castle with growing urgency. They finally discovered him in a forgotten corner of the keep, drunk and dishevelled, surrounded by empty wine cups and the remnants of a night spent trying to forget the weight of his own name. He did not want to be king. He knew what it would mean. War with his half-sister Rhaenyra, the destruction of their family, and the end of the peace his father had so carefully maintained. But Alicent and Criston Cole did not give him a choice. They laid out the stakes with cold clarity. If he did not take the throne, the Greens would be destroyed. Rhaenyra would not spare them, and so Aegon, reluctant and afraid, agreed to be crowned. The coronation was arranged with haste. The great sept of Baelor was prepared, and the streets of King's Landing were lined with small folk who had heard rumours but knew little of the truth. They came to see a king crowned, and they were not disappointed. Aegon walked through the city in a procession of gold and green, flanked by the Kingsguard in their white cloaks. At the steps of the sept, he knelt before the altar of the Father, and Sir Criston Cole stepped forward. In his hands, he held the crown of Aegon the Conqueror, the circlet of Valyrian steel set with rubies that had not been worn since the days of the first Aegon. With a steady hand, the Lord Commander placed that ancient crown upon the head of the new king. It was a moment that transformed Criston Cole from a knight into an architect of war. By placing that crown, he bound himself and the entire Kingsguard to Aegon's cause. There would be no turning back. As the crown settled onto Aegon's brow, a shadow passed over the crowd. The dragon Sunfire, golden and magnificent, descended from the sky and landed atop the great sept. The beast opened its wings and let out a roar that echoed across the city. It was a display of Targaryen majesty that silenced every doubt. Here was a king with a dragon, a living symbol of the blood of old Valyria. The people cheered, not because they loved Aegon, but because they loved the spectacle. They had seen a king crowned, and they had seen a dragon answer his call. It was enough. Word spread from the capital like ripples on a still pond. Riders carried the news to every corner of the realm. In the Red Keep, ravens took flight with letters sealed in green wax. The message was simple. King Viserys was dead, and his son Aegon II had been crowned in his place. But in Dragonstone, another message had already arrived, carried by a different raven, sealed with black wax. Rhaenyra Targaryen knew that her father was dead, and she knew that her half-brother had seized the throne. The realm now had 2 monarchs, and both claimed the Iron Throne. There was no room for negotiation, no path to compromise. The dance of the dragons had begun. In the days that followed, the Greens consolidated their hold on King's Landing. The treasury was secured. The gold cloaks were sworn to the new king, and the lords of the Crown Lands were summoned to bend the knee. But across the narrow sea, on Dragonstone, Rhaenyra gathered her own council. She had her own dragons, her own allies, and her own claim. The war would not be decided by words or by crowns. It would be decided by fire and blood, and the first blood would be spilled, not in a great battle, but in the stormy skies above a castle called Storm's End. The ravens flew from King's Landing to Dragonstone, carrying news that would shatter the peace of the island fortress. But they arrived at the worst possible moment. Rhaenyra Targaryen, the named heir of Viserys I, was in the throes of a labour that had gone terribly wrong. Her pregnancy had been difficult from the start, and the stress of the past weeks, the silence from the capital, the sudden absence of ravens, the ominous quiet, had taken its toll. Now, as the maesters and midwives struggled to save both mother and child, the first ravens landed in the yard with the seal of the hand of the king. The news was delivered to Daemon Targaryen first, for Rhaenyra could not be disturbed. Aegon II had been crowned in the Dragonpit before a cheering crowd. The Conqueror's crown, the same crown that had once sat upon Viserys' brow, now rested on the head of his son. The Green Council had moved with ruthless efficiency. They had not even waited for the king's body to grow cold before they locked the doors and crowned their chosen monarch, and they had sent no word to Dragonstone until the deed was done. Daemon's face turned to stone when he heard the message, but he could not act on it yet, not while his wife lay in the birthing chamber, fighting for her life. He waited. The hours stretched. The labour continued, and then finally, the worst outcome came to pass. The child was born, a daughter, perfect in form, but still, she had never drawn breath. Rhaenyra had lost the baby. The first casualty of the succession crisis was not a knight in armour or a dragon in the sky, but a tiny unnamed princess who never saw the light of the world. When Rhaenyra finally learned what had happened in King's Landing, the grief and the fury merged into something cold and hard. She had lost her father, she had lost her child, and now she had lost her throne. But she did not break. She gathered herself, and she prepared to claim what was hers. The coronation took place on Dragonstone, not in the grand halls of the Red Keep, but on the windswept stone of the ancient fortress, beneath the shadow of the Dragonmont. The lords who had remained loyal to Rhaenyra's cause gathered there. The Velaryons, the Starks, the Arryns, and others who had sworn oaths to her as Viserys' heir. Daemon Targaryen placed the crown upon her head. Not the Conqueror's crown, which was lost to her now, but the crown of her father, the one Viserys had worn. It was a heavy circle of gold and Valyrian steel, set with rubies the size of a man's thumb. As it settled onto her brow, Rhaenyra became the first queen regnant of the Seven Kingdoms in her own right, crowned before the Black Lords and their dragons. The dragons themselves bore witness. Syrax, Rhaenyra's golden queen, let out a cry that echoed across the narrow sea. Caraxes, Daemon's bloodworm, coiled and hissed, and the younger dragons, Vermax and Arax and Tyraxes, added their voices to the chorus. It was a coronation unlike any other, a declaration of war written in fire and blood. Yet Rhaenyra did not immediately unleash that fire. She knew what a dragon war would mean. If she sent her riders against King's Landing, the city would burn. The small folk would die by the thousands. The realm she intended to rule would be reduced to ash before she ever sat the Iron Throne. So instead of rushing into battle, she sent terms. She offered Aegon a chance to surrender, to abdicate, to avoid the catastrophe that was surely coming. She offered peace, knowing full well that it would likely be refused. But the offer was made. The ravens flew again, this time from Dragonstone to the Red Keep, carrying Rhaenyra's terms. And while she waited for a reply that would never come, she began to prepare for the war that she had hoped to avoid. The Blacks would not strike first, but they would be ready when the Greens made their move. The first move, however, would not come from either side's armies. It would come from the sky, over the stormy waters of Shipbreaker Bay, where a young prince and his dragon would meet a fate that would make any hope of peace impossible. On Dragonstone, Rhaenyra Targaryen held her stillborn daughter in her arms, and the child had no name. The labour had come upon her as ravens arrived from King's Landing, bearing news that her half-brother Aegon had been crowned in the Great Sept. The maesters had done what they could, but the babe was born too early, too small, and she never drew breath. Rhaenyra named her Visenya, after the Conqueror's sister wife, a name meant for a warrior queen. But Visenya would never ride a dragon, never sit a throne, never even see the sun. And in that moment, the war for the Iron Throne claimed its first casualty before a single sword had been drawn in open battle. The news of Aegon's coronation spread like wildfire through the Seven Kingdoms. But it was not the only message flying from tower to tower. Both queens, Rhaenyra on Dragonstone and Alicent in King's Landing, understood that the war would not be won by crowns alone. They needed swords, ships, and the loyalty of the great houses. So they sent envoys across Westeros, asking old allies to honour old promises. Every lord in the realm received a raven, sometimes two, each scroll bearing a different seal, each demanding a choice. Would you stand for the king who was crowned by the High Septon, or for the heir who was named by the dying king himself? Would you follow blood, or law, or geography, or fear, or opportunity? The answer was rarely simple. The Greens held the capital. King's Landing was theirs, with its red keep, its gold cloaks, its thousands of small folk who had cheered when Aegon II rode through the streets on Sunfire. They also held Old Town, the ancient seat of the Faith, and the Citadel, where the Hightowers had ruled for generations. Much of the Reach had declared for Aegon, for the Tyrells sat in Highgarden, but the true power lay with Lord Aemond Hightower, who commanded the largest army in the south. And then there was Casterly Rock. The Lannisters had gold, and they had swords, and they had Lord Jason Lannister, who had been a friend to the Greens from the start. The wealth of House Lannister flowed into the royal treasury, funding the war effort before the first battle was even fought. But the Blacks were not without strength of their own. Rhaenyra held Dragonstone, the ancient seat of House Targaryen, and Driftmark, the seat of House Velaryon. The Velaryon fleet was the most powerful in all of Westeros, commanded by Lord Corlys, the sea snake, whose ships had sailed to the ends of the earth. The Riverlands were divided, but many of its lords had sworn to Rhaenyra, including the powerful houses of the Trident, and the Vale of Arryn stood firmly behind her. For Lady Jane Arryn had been a close friend of Rhaenyra's mother, and she remembered the promise Viserys had made. The Eyrie would not bend the knee to a usurper. Every lord in Westeros now faced a question that would define his house for generations. Some chose by blood. The Starks of Winterfell had always been distant from southern politics, but they remembered that Rhaenyra's mother was an Arryn, and the Starks had never forgotten an oath. Others chose by law. The Maesters argued that a daughter should inherit before a brother, but the precedent of the Great Council of 101 favoured male heirs. Still others chose by geography. The Lords of the Reach, surrounded by Hightower power, had little choice but to bend the knee to Aegon, and some chose by fear. The Lords of the Stormlands, whose liege Lord Boros Baratheon had already declared for the Greens after Aemond Targaryen flew Vhagar to Storm's End, knew that a dragon at your gate is a powerful argument, and some chose by opportunity. Lord Larys Strong the Clubfoot had his own reasons for backing the Greens. Lord Unwin Peake saw a chance to rise from a minor house to the regency of the realm, and the Dragonseeds, the bastard sons and daughters of Targaryen blood, would soon see their chance to claim dragons of their own. But that was still to come. For now, the realm held its breath. The ravens flew from every castle, carrying declarations of loyalty or defiance. The great houses made their choices, and the small folk prepared for what they knew was coming. The dance of the dragons had not yet begun in earnest, but the pieces were being set, and the first move would be made not by a queen or a king, but by a prince with one eye and a dragon the size of a castle. The ravens had flown, and the replies began to arrive. Both queens had sent their envoys across Westeros seeking to bind old alliances with fresh oaths. The Greens held King's Landing, Old Town, much of the Reach, and the gold of Casterly Rock, but the Blacks held Dragonstone, the Narrow Sea, and the North, through the pact made by Jacaerys Velaryon. Rhaenyra needed more. She needed the Stormlands. Lord Boros Baratheon ruled Storm's End, a castle ancient and stubborn, perched on a cliff above Shipbreaker Bay. His father had been a loyal friend to Viserys I, but Boros was a different man. He had 4 daughters and no sons, and he wanted what every lord wants: advantage. Rhaenyra sent her second son, Lucerys Velaryon, to deliver her message. Lucerys was barely 14, but he was a dragon rider. His dragon, Arax, was young and quick but small. It was a risk, but Rhaenyra trusted her son's errand. Lucerys flew south on Arax, the grey-green waters of the Narrow Sea passing beneath them. The storm clouds gathered as they approached Storm's End. The castle's massive drum tower rose from the cliffs, its walls black and wet with sea spray. Lucerys landed in the courtyard, and the guards led him inside. The great hall of Storm's End was lit by torches that flickered against the stone. Lord Boros sat in the high seat, a heavy man with a heavy brow, and beside him, already standing with a cold smile, was Aemond Targaryen. Aemond had arrived before Lucerys, riding Vargar, the largest living dragon in the world. He had come to offer the Greens' proposal, a marriage alliance between Boros's eldest daughter and Aegon II's heir, and he had come to demand something else. When Lucerys knelt and delivered Rhaenyra's plea for the Stormlands to honour their oaths, Lord Boros listened, but he did not answer. Instead, he looked to Aemond. Aemond stepped forward, his one eye fixed on Lucerys. He spoke of the night at Driftmark years ago, when Lucerys had taken his eye with a blade. He demanded repayment. An eye for an eye, he said. He wanted Lucerys to yield one of his own eyes, as a price for the blood debt. Lucerys stood his ground. He was a prince, and he would not mutilate himself. Lord Boros, for all his bluster, refused to allow bloodshed beneath his roof. He told them both to leave. The storm outside was worsening, and the night was black. He could not control the weather, but he would not have murder in his hall. Lucerys and Aemond were dismissed. Lucerys hurried to the courtyard. He mounted Arax, and the young dragon took to the sky. The wind howled. Rain lashed the walls. The clouds were so thick that the stars were gone. Lucerys flew low over the bay, trying to find his way back to Dragonstone, but Aemond had followed. Above Shipbreaker Bay, in the darkness of the storm, Aemond urged Vargar after the smaller dragon. Vargar was ancient, massive and battle-hardened. Arax was fast, but he was no match. The storm swallowed sound and sight. Lucerys tried to climb, to escape into the clouds, but Vargar rose faster. Aemond gave the command. Vhagar struck. Arax screamed. The dragon and his rider were torn apart in the black sky. Lucerys Velaryon fell into the sea, his body lost to the waves. Arax's remains scattered across the rocks of Shipbreaker Bay. It was over in moments. When the news reached Dragonstone, Rhaenyra's grief turned to fury. She had lost her son. The Greens had drawn first blood. All hope of a restrained conflict, of a war fought with words and oaths, died in that storm. The dance of the dragons would now be a war of fire and blood, and in the Riverlands, the first land battles were already beginning. The lords who had chosen sides were marching, and the rivers would soon run red. The Riverlands became the first great slaughterhouse of the war. Lord Jason Lannister marched east from the Golden Tooth with an army of 3,000 men, supported by a force from House Rain. They met the Riverlords loyal to Rhaenyra in the hills near the Red Fork. The battle was fierce but brief. The Lannister host, better armed and more disciplined, shattered the Riverlander line. Lord Lefford fell, and the survivors scattered. The way to Harrenhal lay open, but Harrenhal was a cursed place, and its new master, Lord Simon Strong, had declared for Rhaenyra. He was an old man, and his garrison was thin. When word of the Lannister advance reached him, he sent ravens to every lord who might answer. Daemon Targaryen was already in the Riverlands, riding Caraxes. He had left Dragonstone after the news of Lucerys' death his fury cold and silent. He landed at Harrenhal with a handful of men and took command. The castle's vast, melted towers echoed with his footsteps. He sent riders to rally the loyal lords, the Blackwoods, the Mallisters, the Pipers, and he waited. Meanwhile, in King's Landing, Aegon II held court. He wore the conqueror's crown, but it sat heavy on his brow. His hand, Sir Otto Hightower, urged caution. The death of Lucerys had been a mistake, a crime that would unite the Blacks. But Aegon listened to his mother, Queen Alicent, and to his brother Aemond. Aemond returned from Storm's End, his face unreadable. He had killed a boy, but he spoke of it as a necessity. The war was begun. There could be no turning back. The Greens moved to secure the Reach. Lord Ormond Hightower gathered a host at Old Town, while Sir Criston Cole, the Lord Commander of the Kingsguard, led a smaller force toward the Riverlands to link with the Lannisters. Cole was a cold man, a knight without mercy. He had been Rhaenyra's sworn shield once, but now he was her enemy. He marched through the rain, his white cloak stained with mud. In the north, Cregan Stark had received Jacaerys' message. The pact was sealed with a kiss and a promise. Cregan would send his wolves south, but winter was coming, and the north moved slowly. He sent a vanguard of 2,000 men under Lord Manderley. But the main host would not march until the snows cleared. On Dragonstone, Rhaenyra gathered her war council. She had lost a son, but she still had 3 others. Joffrey was young, but he had a dragon. Daemon had left her, but he was fighting in her name. She sent ravens to the Vale, to the Riverlands, to the Lords of the Narrow Sea. She would not be passive. She would strike where the Greens were weakest. And so the first blows of the dance were struck not by armies, but by dragons. Rhaenyra ordered a blockade of the Gullet, the sea route to King's Landing. A fleet commanded by Lord Corlys Velaryon closed the Blackwater Bay. No ships could enter or leave without her leave. The city began to starve. Aegon's response was to send his own dragons. Aemond and Vhagar flew to the Riverlands to burn the Blackwood lands. Daemon and Caraxes met them in the sky above the Red Fork. But the 2 dragons circled each other like wolves, neither willing to commit to a fight that could destroy them both. The war had become a dance of shadows and fire, and the realm bled. The storm that swallowed Lucerys Velaryon and his dragon Arax did not end when the waves calmed. It only moved inland. When the Raven reached Dragonstone with the news, Black Council fell into a silence that was worse than any scream. Rhaenyra had lost her father, her throne, and now her second son. She had sent Lucerys as a messenger, not a warrior, trusting the ancient laws of guest right and the bonds of blood. Aemond One Eye had repaid that trust with fire and fangs above Shipbreaker Bay. The boy was 14 years old. For Rhaenyra, the death of Lucerys broke something that could not be mended. She had spent months trying to avoid open war, sending envoys instead of armies, hoping the lords of Westeros would honour the oath they had sworn to her father. Now she understood that the Greens would never negotiate, never compromise, never stop until every one of her children was dead. Her remaining faith in diplomacy evaporated in that single moment. The Black Cause was devastated, not just by the loss of a prince and a dragon, but by the realization that this war would be fought without mercy. Daemon Targaryen, her husband and the most dangerous man in the realm, did not grieve. He calculated. He had seen war before, had waged it across the Stepstones and the Riverlands, and he knew that the only language the Greens understood was blood. Lucerys was dead. Aemond had taken a son. Daemon would answer in kind. A son for a son. The plan he set in motion was not a battle. It was not a siege or a dragon raid. It was a surgical strike into the heart of the Red Keep, the most heavily guarded fortress in Westeros. While the Green Court still celebrated Aegon II's coronation and Aemond's victory, Daemon reached into the underworld of King's Landing, into the sewers and tunnels and forgotten passages that honeycombed the city's foundations. He found 2 men willing to do what knights would not. One was called Blood, a former gold cloak, a man who had once served the city watch under Daemon himself, dismissed for violence and cruelty. He knew the secret ways into the castle, the forgotten postern gates, the routes that even the Kingsguard did not watch. The other was called Cheese, a rat catcher by trade, a man who knew every crawl space and pantry in the Red Keep, every servant's passage, every shadow where a man could hide. Together, they formed an unlikely but deadly pair. Daemon gave them their instructions. They were to enter the castle, find one of Aegon II's children, and kill the boy in front of his mother, a son for a son. The message had to be unmistakable. The Blacks would not limit their vengeance. They would reach into the Green's own bedchamber. On the night of the deed, Blood and Cheese slipped through a forgotten sewer grate that opened into the castle's lower levels. They moved through the darkness with the confidence of men who knew every turn. The Red Keep was vast, but its defences were designed to repel armies, not two determined killers with inside knowledge. They bypassed the guards, climbed a service stair, and entered the royal apartments without raising an alarm. They found Queen Helaena, Aegon II's wife and sister, in her chambers with her 3 children. The twins, Jaehaerys and Jaera, were 6 years old. Their younger brother Maelor was only 2. Helaena was a gentle soul, known for her love of insects and her prophetic whispers, but she was no warrior. When the 2 men appeared in her doorway, she had no time to scream. Blood grabbed her by the hair and pressed a dagger to her throat. Cheese held the door. They told her what they wanted, one of her sons. She had to choose which one would die. If she refused, they would kill all 3 children in front of her. Helaena begged. She offered them gold, jewels, anything. They were not interested. She tried to bargain, to delay, to think of some way to save her children. But Blood was not a man who could be moved by tears. He reminded her that they were there for a son, and a son they would have. In desperation, Helaena pointed to her youngest Maelor, hoping perhaps that the killers would spare a child so small. But Cheese shook his head. They knew the ages. They knew which prince was the heir. They wanted Jaehaerys, the 6-year-old boy who wore his father's name and stood next in line for the Iron Throne. Helaena tried to shield him with her own body, but Blood shoved her aside. He grabbed the boy by the arm. Jaehaerys cried out for his mother. Blood did not hesitate. He cut the child's throat, and then, to ensure the deed was done, he struck off his head. The Queen's chambers became a slaughterhouse. The killers left the body where it fell. They took the boy's head with them as proof, disappearing back into the tunnels, before the castle could even raise an alarm. When the guards finally arrived, they found Helaena covered in her son's blood, holding the headless body of her firstborn, screaming words that no one could understand. The murder of young Prince Jaehaerys transformed the war. What had been a conflict over succession, a political struggle between 2 claimants to a throne, became something far darker. It was no longer a war of armies and dragons. It was a war haunted by murdered children. The Greens had killed Lucerys at Storm's End. The Blacks had answered with Jaehaerys in the Red Keep. Both sides had now crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. In the days that followed, King's Landing descended into paranoia. The Gold Cloaks searched every cellar and sewer. The Kingsguard doubled their patrols. But the damage was done. Aegon II's court, already fractured by the rivalry between the king and his brother, Aemond, now had to contend with the knowledge that no wall, no guard, no lock could keep out the Blacks' vengeance. Helaena never recovered. She retreated into her own mind, speaking only in riddles and prophecies. A ghost in the castle she had once called home. Rhaenyra received the news on Dragonstone with a face of stone. She did not celebrate. She did not weep. She simply nodded, as if she had known this was the only possible outcome. Daemon stood beside her, his expression unreadable. The message had been sent. The Greens now understood what kind of war they had started, but the cost of that message was not yet fully counted. The murder of a child, even an enemy's child, stained the Black cause in the eyes of many lords who had been wavering. Some who had considered supporting Rhaenyra now drew back, horrified by the brutality of the act. Others, already committed to the Greens, used Jaehaerys's death to rally support, painting the Blacks as monsters who would stop at nothing. The War of Ravens and Oaths became a war of propaganda, each side accusing the other of atrocities. And yet, for all the horror, the war was only beginning. The death of Jaehaerys did not end the conflict. It hardened both sides. The Greens, driven by grief and rage, began to mobilize their full military strength. The Blacks, knowing they could never negotiate again, prepared for total war. The dragons were stirring across the realm. And the next blow would not be struck in a bedchamber. It would be struck on a battlefield, where armies would clash and the sky would burn. Before we dive deeper into this incredible journey, I'm curious, where in the world are you watching this from? Drop a comment below and let our global community know. And if you're finding this as mind-blowing as I am, hit that like button to help more people discover this story. Daemon Targaryen had promised a son for a son, and he delivered. The death of Prince Jaehaerys, Aegon II's heir, sent a shockwave through King's Landing. But vengeance in a civil war is never a single act. It is a cycle, and the next turn of that cycle would not begin in the shadow of the Red Keep, but in the ancient blood-soaked soil of the Riverlands. The Riverlands have always been a crossroads, a place where armies march and where old hatreds never truly die. No feud in all of Westeros is older or more bitter than the one between House Bracken and House Blackwood. They have fought for 6,000 years, over land, over honour, over a slight whispered 1,000 generations ago. Their castles, Stonehenge and Raventry Hall, sit within sight of each other, and their people have learned to live with the memory of violence, the way other folk live with the change of seasons. When the Dance of the Dragons began, both houses were sworn to the Iron Throne, but they were not sworn to the same king. Lord Bracken, ever pragmatic and mindful of the power in King's Landing, declared for Aegon II. Lord Blackwood, proud and stubborn, held to the oath his ancestors had sworn to Rhaenyra. And so, beneath the rival royal banners, the ancient feud ignited once more. The spark came on the banks of the Red Fork, at a place called the Burning Mill. It was not a grand strategic objective. No army had been sent to take it. It was a mill, a working mill, where the Blackwood tenants ground their grain. The Brackens, in a show of force, rode out to seize it. They burned it to the ground. It was a provocation, a declaration that this war for them was personal. The Blackwoods answered in force. Lord Samuel Blackwood gathered his knights and his archers, the men who had grown up hearing the same stories of Bracken treachery, and he marched. The two hosts met on the scorched ground around the mill, the ashes of the fire still warm beneath their feet. There was no parley, no offer of terms. There was only the charge. The battle at the Burning Mill became one of the first major land clashes of the Dance of the Dragons. It was not a battle of dragons. It was a battle of men, of sword and spear and arrow, fought in the mud and the smoke. The Blackwood archers, famed for their longbows, loosed volley after volley into the Bracken ranks. The Bracken knights, heavy and armoured, drove into the Blackwood centre. It was a slaughter, brutal and intimate, the kind of fight where you can see the face of the man trying to kill you, and it revealed something terrible. This war was not going to be a clean contest of armies and kings. It was going to be a war where every local grievance, every old wound, every stolen cow and broken betrothal would be given a new, deadly purpose. The larger civil war did not simply absorb the Riverlands. The Riverlands absorbed the war and made it more brutal. The fight for the Iron Throne became a license for every petty lord to settle his scores with fire and blood. The Blackwoods won the day at the Burning Mill. Lord Bracken was slain, his body left in the ashes. But the victory was hollow. The Brackens did not surrender. They retreated, sent ravens to their allies, and waited for the chance to strike again. And the Riverlands, once a fertile land of rivers and fields, became the war's central killing ground. It would be crossed again and again by armies, by refugees fleeing the flames, and by the shadows of dragons passing overhead. The Burning Mill was just the first drop of blood in a flood that would drown the region. And as the smoke cleared, The war was only just beginning to find its true, terrible shape. The next blow would not come from the riverbanks, but from the air, over a castle that had known more than its share of ghosts. The castle that had known more than its share of ghosts was Harrenhal, a monument to tyranny, built by Harren the Black and cursed by dragonfire. It stood as a hollow, twisted shell of stone and legend. In the Dance of the Dragons, Harrenhal became a prize both sides coveted and feared. Its massive walls could hold an army, but its halls whispered of madness and doom. Prince Daemon Targaryen, fresh from his vengeance in King's Landing, saw Harrenhal as a base to rally the River Lords to Rhaenyra's cause. He flew there on Caraxes, the Bloodworm, and claimed the castle for the Blacks. The garrison, loyal to Aegon II, melted away at the sight of a dragon. But Harrenhal was never truly held by any man. It held you. Daemon walked its corridors, past the burnt tower where Harren and his sons perished, past the weirwood tree in the Godswood that wept red sap like tears. He felt the weight of centuries of suffering, and he waited for word from the River Lords, for the next move from the Greens, for the war to come to him. But the castle had its own plans. Men began to whisper of strange sounds at night, of shadows that moved without a source, of a woman in white who walked the battlements. Daemon dismissed the tales, but his men grew restless. The ghosts of Harrenhal were not just stories, they were a warning. The war would not be decided by sieges or marches alone. It would be decided by who could endure the madness that came with the crown. And in the heart of the Riverlands, in that cursed castle, Daemon Targaryen began to understand that the price of the throne was not just blood, it was the soul. The blood of the burning mill had barely dried before Daemon Targaryen made his move. The Riverlands were now a patchwork of smouldering feuds, and the war needed a centre of gravity. Daemon understood something that the Green Commands had not yet grasped. Control of the Riverlands meant control of the war's supply lines, its roads, its loyalties. And at the heart of that contested region sat Harrenhal. Harrenhal is not a castle in the ordinary sense. It is a monument to ambition and folly, built by Harren the Black 3 centuries before the dance. Its towers are so vast that they seem to mock the sky, its halls large enough to swallow entire armies. But the castle has always carried a curse. Every lord who has held it has met ruin, and the stones themselves seem to weep with old sorrow. Yet for all its grim reputation, Harrenhal is the single most formidable fortress in the Riverlands, and its walls, though scarred by dragonfire from Aegon the Conqueror's time, are still thick enough to withstand any conventional siege. Daemon did not intend to besiege it. He intended to take it without a fight. He mounted Caraxes, the Bloodworm, a dragon as fierce and unpredictable as his rider. Caraxes had grown lean and battle-hardened over the years. His scales are deep red, almost black in shadow. Together they rose from Dragonstone and flew north, crossing the narrow sea and then the vast expanse of the Riverlands. The journey was long, but Caraxes was swift. By the time the castle's twisted towers appeared on the horizon, the sun was low, casting long shadows across the lake that surrounded Harrenhal's southern face. The garrison saw the dragon long before Daemon landed. A dragon in the sky is a message that needs no translation. Sir Simon Strong, the Castellan who held Harrenhal in the name of his absent nephew, Lord Larys Strong, understood that message immediately. Larys was in King's Landing, serving as Master of Whisperers to the Green Council. Sir Simon was an old man, past 70, with no taste for heroics and no desire to see his men roasted alive. He ordered the gates opened. Daemon descended into the main courtyard, Caraxes folding his wings and hissing at the assembled guards. The Bloodworm's presence alone was enough to empty the battlements. Sir Simon came forward, unarmed, and knelt. He offered the keys of the castle, and Daemon accepted them with a nod. There was no bloodshed, no siege, no palimpsest. The largest fortress in Westeros had fallen without a single sword being drawn. The bloodless capture of Harrenhal was a masterstroke. It gave the Blacks a base of operations within striking distance of King's Landing, yet far enough from the capital to avoid immediate retaliation. It placed Daemon in the heart of the Riverlands, where he could rally sympathetic lords, threaten green supply lines, and project power across the contested middle of the continent. More than that, it was a symbol. The Blacks now held a castle that had once been the seat of the Ironborn kings, a place that had resisted Aegon the Conqueror for years before Dragonfire finally brought it low. Now it belonged to a Targaryen prince who rode a dragon of his own. Harrenhal became Daemon's watchtower. From its highest turret, the Tower of Ghosts, he could see for miles across the lakes and fields. He used the castle as a command post, sending ravens to Black allies and receiving reports from spies and scouts. He also used it as a prison, holding captured green knights and lords in the damp, echoing dungeons. And he used it as a staging ground for raids, sending out small bands of men to harry enemy supply trains and test the loyalty of local houses. But Harrenhal was also an ominous symbol. The castle had a way of corrupting those who held it, and Daemon was not immune to its dark influence. He began to grow restless, impatient. The war was still young, but the bloodshed had already cost him a stepson, Lucerys. The memory of that loss gnawed at him, and Harrenhal's haunted halls seemed to amplify every bitter thought. He spent long nights in the Great Hall, staring at maps, planning moves that would become more aggressive as the months wore on. For now, though, the capture of Harrenhal gave the Blacks a firm foothold. The Riverlands were far from secure. But Daemon's presence there forced the Greens to respond. They could not ignore a dragon rider sitting in the middle of their most contested territory. And so the war began to shift, slowly, from a series of scattered skirmishes to a more concentrated struggle for control of the land between the Trident and the Blackwater. From Harrenhal, Daemon could see the smoke of burning villages on clear days. He could hear the distant clash of steel from battles fought along the rivers. The war was coming to him, and he was ready to meet it. But the next blow would not come from the ground. It would come from the sky, and it would change everything. Daemon Targaryen had taken Harrenhal without a single arrow loosed, without a single stone thrown. The vast fortress, cursed by its builder and haunted by its history, now flew the black banner of Rhaenyra. But while Daemon consolidated his hold on the Riverlands, the Greens were not idle. In King's Landing, the hand of the king, Sir Criston Cole, understood that political victories meant little without military force to back them. He had spent weeks securing the capital, ensuring the loyalty of the Gold Cloaks and the court, but the true test lay beyond the walls. So Cole made a decision that would define the early war. He would march. Criston Cole left King's Landing not as a fugitive or a desperate commander, but as a man determined to turn the Greens' political strength into battlefield success. He gathered the Crownlands lords, who had sworn for Aegon II, summoning their levies from Rosby, Stokeworth, Duskendale, and the smaller keeps along the coast. These were not the great armies of the Reach or the West, but they were disciplined, well-supplied and loyal. Cole knew that the Blacks held Dragonstone, a fortress only a day's sail from the capital, and that Rhaenyra's dragons could strike at any moment. But he also knew that dragons could not hold ground, armies could, and so he planned a campaign that would draw the Blacks out, divide their supporters, and force them to fight on terms that favoured the Greens. The first target was obvious, the island of Dragonstone itself, but Cole was no fool. A direct assault on a fortress guarded by dragons was suicide. Instead, he aimed to cut off the island's supply lines, to starve it into submission, and to pressure the lords of the narrow sea to abandon Rhaenyra. He sent riders to the Stormlands, to the Reach, to the Riverlands, carrying messages that offered pardons and rewards to any Black Lord who switched sides. He sought to divide the enemy before their dragons could unite, to break their will with the slow, grinding pressure of a siege that never quite began. Yet every green march was shadowed by the knowledge that a dragon might arrive without warning. Cole's army moved cautiously, scouts fanning out in all directions, lookouts scanning the skies for the telltale shape of wings. The men knew that Vhagar was with them, ridden by Prince Aemond. But Vhagar could not be everywhere, and the Blacks had Caraxes, Syrax, and the young dragons of Rhaenyra's sons. One mistake, one moment of carelessness, and a column of soldiers could be turned to ash in minutes. Still, Cole pressed on. He understood something that many in the Green Council had forgotten. That army still mattered, even in a conflict dominated by dragonfire. Dragons could win battles, but they could not hold castles, garrison towns, or enforce a blockade. Only men could do that. And so he marched his host out of King's Landing, past the gates of the city and into the countryside, heading east toward the coast. His plan was to secure the key strongholds of the Crownlands, to deny the Blacks any foothold on the mainland, and to prepare for the inevitable confrontation that would decide the fate of the realm. The lords of the Crownlands, many of whom had wavered in their loyalty, now saw the Green Army moving with purpose. They brought their swords, their spears, their horses. Cole's camp grew, and with it the morale of his men. They believed in their commander, in his discipline, in his strategy. They did not know that the storm was already gathering on the horizon, that the Blacks were not idle, that Rhaenyra had already sent her own riders to rally her supporters. The war was no longer a matter of ravens and oaths. It was a matter of steel and fire, and so the Green Army marched, step by step, mile by mile, toward the inevitable clash. The land itself seemed to hold its breath. The rivers ran silent, the roads empty. Farmers hid their harvests, shepherds drove their flocks into the hills. Every village they passed was abandoned, every castle closed its gates. The people knew what was coming. They had heard the stories of the burning mill, of the bloodshed in the Riverlands. They knew that the dragons would soon take to the sky, and that when they did, nothing would be the same. Criston Cole rode at the head of his column, his white cloak stained with dust, his armour gleaming in the pale sun. He was a man of iron will, a knight who had risen from nothing to become the Lord Commander of the King's Guard. He had fought in tourneys, in skirmishes, in the great battles of the Stepstones. But this was different. This was a war for the very soul of the realm, and he intended to win it. But even as he marched, the shadows lengthened. The dragons were coming. Not yet, not today, but soon. And when they did, the ground would tremble, the sky would burn, and the war would become something far more terrible than any man could imagine. Criston Cole had left King's Landing with a purpose. He gathered the banners of the Crownlands, called upon the lords who still held faith in Aegon II's claim, and began to move. His plan was not to strike directly at Dragonstone. Not yet. The Blacks held the sea, and they held the larger dragons. But the Greens had numbers on the ground, and Cole intended to use them. He would draw the Black Dragon Riders out, force them to fight on his terms, and break their strength piece by piece. The first target was Rook's Rest, a modest castle on the coast of the Blackwater Bay, held by a Black loyalist lord named Staunton. It was not a great fortress, not Harrenhal or Storm's End, but it sat close enough to King's Landing to threaten the Green supply lines along the coast. If the Greens could take Rook's Rest, they would tighten their grip on the sea approaches and send a clear message to every lord still wavering between the two crowns. So Cole marched. He led a host of Crownlands men, perhaps 2,000 strong, and laid siege to the castle. The walls of Rook's Rest were old, not built to withstand a prolonged assault, and Lord Staunton knew he could not hold out forever. He sent ravens to Dragonstone, begging for aid. Rhaenyra had to respond. If she let Rook's Rest fall without a fight, every other Black-held castle in the Crownlands would see that she would not protect them. The war would bleed away into 1,000 small surrenders. But sending a dragon was a gamble. The Greens had dragons too, and no one knew exactly where they were. Aegon II had Sunfire, golden and fierce. Aemond had Vhagar, the largest living dragon in the world, and there was still Helaena with Dreamfire, though she had not yet taken to battle. Rhaenyra could not risk her own dragon, Syrax, not when she was the heart of the Black cause. Daemon was at Harrenhal, holding the Riverlands. Jasterus was flying missions across the north and the Vale. That left Rhaenys. Rhaenys Targaryen, the queen who never was, had been passed over for the throne twice. She had watched her children die, had seen her house tear itself apart, but she remained loyal to Rhaenyra, and she still rode Meleys, the Red Queen. Meleys was fast, experienced, and fierce. If any dragon could break a siege and return safely, it was her. Rhaenyra gave the order. Rhaenys mounted Meleys and flew east, toward Rook's Rest. She arrived to find the Green Army encamped around the castle, siege towers and ladders already being prepared. Meleys dove low, breathing fire, scattering the soldiers and burning their supplies. The siege broke apart in chaos. Men ran for cover, and for a moment it seemed the battle was already won. But this was not a simple siege. It was a trap. Criston Cole had not come to Rook's Rest just to take a castle. He had come to draw a dragon into the open, and he had brought 2 of his own. High above the clouds, hidden from sight, Aegon II sat astride Sunfear, and Aemond One Eye rode Vargar. They had been waning. The moment Meleys revealed herself, they descended. The skies above Rook's Rest became a furnace. 3 dragons collided in a storm of fire and claws. Meleys was fast, but she was alone. Sunfire was younger, but he was strong, and Vargar was a living mountain of scales and rage. Aegon and Aemond had planned this together. They would trap the black dragon between them, strike from 2 sides, and end the threat in a single stroke. Rhaenys fought with everything she had. Meleys tore into Sunfire, ripping great wounds across his golden hide. Aegon screamed as his dragon faltered, and for a moment it seemed the trap might fail. But then Vargar came down. Aemond drove his dragon straight into Meleys, jaws open, claws extended. The 2 dragons tumbled through the sky, locked together, crashing into the ground below. The impact shattered trees and sent a wave of fire across the battlefield. When the dust cleared, Meleys lay dead. Rhaenys Targaryen was gone. Her body never recovered from the wreckage. Sunfire was badly wounded, one wing torn, his side ripped open, but he still lived. Aegon was broken, his leg shattered, his body burned, but he too survived. Vargar had taken damage, but Aemond walked away from the fight. The Greens had won, but at a terrible cost. Rook's Rest was taken. Lord Staunton was killed, his castle burned. The Black Cause had lost its most experienced dragon rider, and the war had entered a new, more brutal phase. The Greens had proven they could set a trap and spring it, but they had also shown that dragons could be killed, that even the greatest of them could fall when the odds were stacked against them. And in the aftermath, the question hung in the air. What would happen when the next dragon came? Because the war was far from over. The Black still held the Riverlands, the North, the Vale, and the sea. Daemon was at Harrenhal, waiting. Jacaerys was rallying the North, and across the narrow sea, the Triarchy was watching, ready to strike at the first sign of weakness. The war would not be decided by a single battle, no matter how devastating. The dance of the dragons was only beginning to find its rhythm. The Green Army had laid siege to Rook's Rest, a black-held castle on the coast of the Crownlands. Lord Staunton, its castellan, sent desperate ravens to Dragonstone, begging for relief. Rhaenyra could not afford to lose another stronghold so close to King's Landing. But she also knew the Greens had set a trap. Sir Criston Cole had marched from the capital with a substantial force, and his encampment outside the castle walls was deliberately visible, almost inviting a dragon attack. The question was whether the Greens had brought their own dragons to answer that invitation. Rhaenys Targaryen, the queen who never was, volunteered to fly Meleys to Rook's Rest. She was the most experienced dragon rider on either side, and Meleys, the Red Queen, was swift and fierce, though not the largest dragon alive. Rhaenys understood the risk. She knew that Aemond and Vargar were somewhere in the Riverlands, and that Aegon II had Sunfire in King's Landing. But if she could break the siege quickly and burn Cole's army, the Greens would lose their momentum. So she took to the sky, her armour gleaming, her dragon's scales the colour of old blood. The battle began as a rout. Meleys dove from the clouds and unleashed a torrent of flame onto the green encampment. Men screamed, tents burned, horses bolted. Sir Criston Cole himself barely escaped the inferno, scrambling into the woods with a handful of knights. For a few minutes, it seemed the trap had failed, that Rhaenys would scatter the army and return to Dragonstone in triumph. But then the real trap sprang. From the east, a golden shape rose above the tree line. Sunfair, the magnificent golden dragon of King Aegon II, climbed into the sky, his rider the young king himself, armoured and eager for his first real battle. Aegon had wanted to prove himself, to match his brother Aemond's reputation. He had insisted on joining the ambush, and Criston Cole had reluctantly agreed, positioning Sunfire behind a ridge to wait for Meleys. Rhaenys saw the golden dragon and did not flee. She turned Meleys to meet him, and the two dragons clashed above the burning camp. Sunfire was younger, but he was large and strong, and his flames were as hot as any. Meleys was faster, more experienced. She tore at Sunfire's wings with her claws, bit deep into his neck. The golden dragon roared in pain, blood streaming down his side. Aegon, on his back, struggled to keep control. For a time it seemed Rhaenys might win. Meleys drove Sunfire downward, forcing him toward the ground. The Red Queen's jaws closed around Sunfire's throat, and the golden dragon faltered. Aegon too was thrown from the saddle, crashing into the ruins of a tower below. He lay there, his leg shattered, his skin burned, barely alive. But the trap had a third element. From the west, a shadow darker than any cloud descended. Vhagar, the oldest and largest dragon in the world, came with Aemond One Eye on her back. Aemond had been waiting, hidden behind a hill, watching the fight unfold. He had seen his brother fall, and he did not hesitate. He drove Vhagar straight into Meleys. The impact was catastrophic. Vhagar's weight alone was nearly twice that of Meleys. Her claws raked the Red Queen's belly. Her teeth snapped at Meleys' neck. Meleys fought back with desperate fury. She tore at Vhagar's face, set fire to her wings. The two dragons tumbled through the sky, locked in a death grapple, their roars shaking the very stones of Rook's Rest. Rhaenys knew she could not win. Vhagar was too large, too powerful, but she could make Aemond pay. She drove Meleys downward, straight into Vhagar, forcing both dragons into a spiral that ended in the castle's ruined courtyard. The impact shattered the ground. Stone walls collapsed. Dust and fire filled the air. When the dust settled, Meleys lay dead, her neck broken, her body crushed beneath Vhagar's bulk. Rhaenys Targaryen was gone, her bones lost among the rubble. She had died fighting as she had lived, with courage and defiance. Sunfear was terribly wounded. One wing was torn, his chest scored with deep gashes, and he would never fly again without pain. Aegon Nu was found in the ruins, his leg shattered in 3 places, his skin blackened by fire, his mind broken by the fall. He would survive, but he would never walk without a limp, never command a dragon again. The Greens had won the battle, but they had lost their king as a fighting force. Aemond emerged from the wreckage unscathed. Vhagar had suffered only minor wounds. He climbed from her saddle, looked at his brother's broken body, and felt no remorse. He had always believed he was the true warrior of the family, and now there was no one to dispute it. He took command of the Green Army on the spot. Sir Criston Cole, humiliated by his near death, deferred to the prince. From that day forward, Aemond One Eye was the Greens' most capable field commander and the most feared. Rook's Rest proved something terrible to both sides. Dragons did not guarantee victory. They only guaranteed devastation. The Blacks had lost one of their most experienced riders and a fierce dragon. The Greens had lost their king's ability to fight and their most beautiful dragon to crippling injury. The war would continue, but the age of dragon supremacy was over. Every battle from now on would be fought with the knowledge that even the mightiest beast could fall, and that the cost of victory was always measured in fire and blood. The news of Rook's Rest spread across the realm. In King's Landing, the Greens celebrated a victory, but their joy was muted. Aegon II lay in a fever, his wounds festering, and the maesters whispered that he might never wake. In Dragonstone, Rhaenyra wept for Rhaenys, her cousin and her friend, and for the loss of Meleys. She had sent her most trusted dragon rider into a trap, and now she had to decide how to answer. The war was no longer a contest of sieges and skirmishes. It was a war of dragons, and the next blow would have to be decisive. But the sea lanes were still open. The Velaryon fleet remained loyal to the Blacks, and from the east, the Triarchy saw an opportunity. The war for the Narrow Sea was about to begin. The Battle of Rook's Rest left a king broken and a dragon crippled, but it did not end the war. Aegon II survived the fall, pulled from the wreckage of his own dragon, Sunfire, by men who barely recognized him. His armor had melted into his flesh. His bones were shattered in a dozen places. The maesters who tended him in the weeks that followed did not expect him to live through the first night. But the king's will was stubborn, and the fire in his blood refused to die. He lingered, burned beyond recognition, unable to speak clearly, unable to move without agony. The Iron Throne now held a shell of a monarch, a man who could no longer walk, could no longer command, could no longer even sit upright without assistance. His reign continued in name, but his body had become a prison, and so the Greens faced a strange and bitter victory. They had won the field at Rook's Rest. They had killed the queen who never was, Rhaenys Targaryen, and her dragon Meleys. They had driven the Blacks back, secured the eastern coast, and proven that their strategy of ambush could work. But the cost was staggering. Sunfire, the golden dragon, the pride of the Green faction, had been so badly mauled that he could no longer fly. His wings were torn, his body scarred, and he lay in a makeshift pen near the battlefield, attended by dragon keepers who could only watch as he refused food. The strongest dragon on the Green side, Vargar, had survived the fight, but even the ancient beast had taken wounds from Meleys' claws and teeth. For the first time in decades, Vargar was not invincible, and the king himself, Aegon II, was a ruin. With the king incapacitated, the Green Council had to decide who would rule in his stead. The obvious choice, and the one that Aegon himself would have resisted had he been able, was his brother Aemond. Aemond One Eye, rider of Vargar, the prince who had lost an eye in childhood and gained a dragon that could darken the sky. Aemond had been the architect of the trap at Rook's Rest. He had flown Vargar into battle alongside Criston Cole's ground forces, and he had been the one to deliver the killing blow against Meleys, though it had cost Sunfire and the king dearly. Now with Aegon barely conscious and unable to speak, the regency fell to Aemond almost by default. He was named Prince Regent, and with that title came the full authority of the crown. He could command armies, issue decrees, and wield the power of the Iron Throne as if it were his own. But Aemond's rule was not the same as Aegon's. The king had been a reluctant leader, often swayed by his mother Alicent and his hand, Otto Hightower. Aemond was different. He was cold, calculating and utterly convinced of his own destiny. He had no patience for courtly politics, no interest in the careful diplomacy that had kept the Greens together. He saw the war as a simple equation. Vargar could burn any enemy, and any enemy who resisted would burn. The terror of Vargar became the instrument of his rule, and the small council soon learned that the Prince Regent would not be questioned. He dismissed his grandfather Otto Hightower from the position of hand, replacing him with a man more loyal to himself. He began planning a campaign that would take the war directly to the Blacks, not through cautious manoeuvring, but through overwhelming force. And yet, for all the power that Aemond now held, the Greens had won a battlefield success that left them weaker than before. Their king was maimed, unable to lead, and his survival was a burden as much as a blessing. Their strongest dragon was crippled, grounded, and would not fly again for months, if ever. The war's balance had grown stranger with each engagement. Every victory seemed to leave the victor less able to enjoy it. The Blacks had lost a dragon and a rider at Rook's Rest, but they still had Caraxes, Syrax, and the young dragons of Rhaenyra's children. The Greens had lost the use of Sunfire and the full strength of their king. Scales were tipping, but not in any clear direction. In the days after Rook's Rest, the realm held its breath. The Green Army under Criston Cole marched south, securing more castles for Aegon's cause. But the Prince Regent Aemond remained in King's Landing, consolidating his power. He ordered the construction of a new crown for himself, one that would symbolize his authority. He began to speak of a grand campaign to destroy the Black forces in the Riverlands once and for all. But the war was no longer a simple contest of armies and dragons. It had become a cycle of destruction, where each side's victories only created new wounds that would fester and spread. The Greens had a regent who commanded the largest dragon in the world, but they also had a king who could not rule and a dragon who could not fly. The Blacks had a queen who had lost her most experienced dragon rider, but she still had the loyalty of the North, the Vale and the Riverlands. The war was far from over, and the next move would come not from the throne room, but from the sea, where the fate of the narrow sea and the supply lines of both sides would soon be decided. With Aemond Targaryen now ruling as Prince Regent, the war entered a new and more dangerous phase. Aegon II lay in his bed, his body broken, his dragon Sunfire so badly wounded that he could barely fly. The Greens had won at Rook's Rest, but the cost had been staggering. Rhaenys Targaryen was dead, Meleys was dead, and the realm had seen for the first time what happens when dragons fight dragons. Yet for all that loss, the Blacks still held a strategic advantage that the Greens could not match. On Dragonstone, in the shadow of the volcanic peak, a dozen dragons remained riderless. They were wild, fierce and untamed, but they were there, and Rhaenyra Targaryen had no one to ride them. The problem was simple. The Blacks had more dragons than they had dragon riders. The Targaryen bloodline was not infinite, and the war had already claimed several of their most experienced riders. Rhaenys was gone. Daemon was in the Riverlands, holding Harrenhal with Caraxes. Jacaerys Velaryon rode Vermax, and his brothers Lucerys and Joffrey were too young for serious combat. Baela and Rhaena, Daemon's daughters, were still training. The Greens, by contrast, had Aemond on Vargar, the largest dragon alive, and they had Criston Cole's army marching through the Crownlands. The Blacks needed more riders, and they needed them quickly. It was Jacaerys Velaryon who proposed the solution. He knew that the Targaryen dynasty had always been careful about who could claim a dragon. Only those with pure Valyrian blood were supposed to mount them. But the blood of old Valyria had spread across the narrow sea over the centuries, through bastards and lesser branches, through the families of Dragonstone itself. There were men and women on that island, and in the nearby towns, who carried the blood of the dragon in their veins, even if they had never been acknowledged. Jacaerys argued that the war was too desperate to stand on ceremony. If a commoner with distant Valyrian ancestry could claim a dragon, then that commoner could fight for the Blacks. Rhaenyra was hesitant at first. The idea of giving dragons to low-born men and women, to people with no loyalty to the crown beyond a promise of reward, was dangerous, but the alternative was worse. The Greens were gathering strength, and every day that passed without new riders was a day that Vargar grew more dominant. So Rhaenyra agreed. Jacaerys flew to Dragonstone and issued the call. He sent word across the island and the nearby shores, offering a great reward to any man or woman of Valyrian descent who could tame one of the wild dragons. They would be given lands, titles, and gold. They would be raised to the status of dragon riders. All they had to do was survive. The response was immediate and chaotic. Hundreds came forward, hoping to claim a dragon. Most were farmers, fishermen, and labourers who had heard stories of their distant Targaryen ancestors. Some were genuine bastards of noble houses. Others were frauds, hoping to bluff their way into a dragon's lair. The dragons themselves were not cooperative. Several of the would-be riders were burned alive. On the first day, their bodies charred and broken on the slopes of Dragonstone. Others were simply ignored, the dragons refusing to acknowledge them. But a few succeeded, and their names would become infamous in the war to come. The first was Hugh Hammer. He was a blacksmith from Dragonstone, a large, powerful man with a temper to match. He claimed the dragon Vermithor, the second largest dragon in the world after Vargar. Vermithor had once been ridden by King Jaehaerys I, and he was old, cunning, and dangerous. Hugh approached him with a hammer in hand, and somehow, through sheer will or luck, he managed to mount the beast. The dragon roared, but he did not burn him. Hugh Hammer became a dragonseed, and he immediately demanded more than he had been promised. The second was Ulf White. He was a drunkard, a man of no particular skill or ambition, but he claimed to have Targaryen blood through a bastard line. He walked up to the dragon Silverwing, who had been ridden by Queen Alysanne, and somehow she accepted him. Ulf became a dragon rider almost by accident, and he quickly grew arrogant, believing himself chosen by fate. Then there was Nettles. She was a young woman, dark-haired and fierce, who claimed no noble blood at all. She arrived on Dragonstone with nothing but a sheep and a rope. She did not try to dominate the dragon. Instead, she fed the wild dragon sheep stealer day after day, earning his trust. It took weeks, but eventually she climbed onto his back and flew. Nettles was the most unlikely of the dragon seeds, and she became one of the most loyal. Finally, there was Adam of Hull. He was the son of a shipwright, a young man from the town of Hull on Driftmark. His mother was a commoner, but his father was rumoured to be Lord Corlys Velaryon himself, the sea snake. Adam had the look of the old Valyrian blood, with silver hair and purple eyes. He claimed the dragon Seasmoke, who had once belonged to Lynor Velaryon. Seasmoke had been riderless for years, and he accepted Adam as if he had been waiting for him. Adam of Hull became a dragon rider, and his loyalty to the Blacks would be tested in the worst possible way. In total, 4 dragonseeds succeeded where dozens had failed. Rhaenyra now had 4 new dragon riders, each mounted on a powerful beast. Vermithor, Silverwing, Sheepstealer and Seasmoke joined the Black cause. It was a tremendous boost to her military strength, but it came with a price. These were not loyal lords or sworn knights. They were men and women who had been given power overnight, and power changes people. Hugh Hammer and Ulf White in particular began to see themselves as equals to the trueborn Targaryens. They demanded higher rewards, better treatment, and a share of the glory. Rhaenyra had gained weapons, but she had also introduced uncertain loyalties into the very heart of her war effort. The Dragonseeds were a gamble, and like all gambles in this war, the outcome was far from certain. They would ride into battle, they would fight for the Blacks, but they would also remember that they had been called upon only because the trueborn riders had failed, and that memory would fester. As the summer of 130 turned toward autumn, the war began to shift. The Greens under Aemond were preparing a massive campaign in the Riverlands, hoping to crush Daemon and bring the Blacks to their knees. The Blacks, with their new dragon riders, were planning to strike back. The next phase of the war would be fought not just with armies and navies, but with dragons on both sides, and the Dragonseeds would be at the centre of it all. The question was whether they would prove to be saviours or destroyers, and the answer would be written in fire and blood. The Dragonseeds had answered the call. Men and women with traces of Valyrian blood came forward to claim the dragons that slept in the volcanic caves of Dragonstone. Some succeeded, like Hugh Hammer, who mounted the great beast Vermithor, and Ulf White, who claimed Silverwing. Others perished in flames, their ambition consumed before it could take wing. But even as these new riders trained and tested their bonds, the war was already shifting to a new front. The sea itself was about to become a battlefield. For months, the Blacks had controlled the waters around Dragonstone and Driftmark. The Velaryon fleet, the largest in Westeros, kept the narrow sea secure, blockading King's Landing and strangling the Greens' supply lines. But the Greens had an ally that the Blacks had not fully accounted for. The Triarchy, a league of free cities from across the narrow sea, had been hired to break the Velaryon's stranglehold. Their ships were swift, their captains experienced in the treacherous waters of the Stepstones, and their numbers were formidable. They struck without warning, descending upon the Velaryon fleet near the Gullet, the stretch of sea between Dragonstone and the coast of the Crownlands. The battle that followed was not a single clash, but a sprawling catastrophe that unfolded across miles of open water. Warships rammed each other, their hulls splintering as men fought with swords and axes on decks slick with blood and seawater. Arrows and crossbow bolts filled the air, and the Triarchy's ships, painted in the colours of Myr, Lys and Tyrosh, pressed the attack with a ferocity that caught the Velaryon captains off guard. Fires broke out as flaming projectiles found their marks, and soon the sea was dotted with burning wrecks, their crews leaping into the churning waves, only to drown in armour or be cut down by enemy sailors. Above the chaos, dragons took to the sky. The Blacks had not anticipated such a large naval assault, but they could not let the fleet be destroyed. Jacaerys Velaryon, Rhaenyra's eldest son and heir to the Iron Throne, mounted his dragon Vermax and flew to the defence. He was young, barely 20 years old, but he carried the weight of his mother's cause. He had been the one to propose the Dragonseeds, and now he felt the need to prove himself in battle, to show that he was not merely a prince by title, but a leader worthy of the crown that would one day be his. Vermax dove into the fray, breathing fire upon the Triarchy ships. The dragon's flames turned wooden decks into infernos, and the enemy sailors screamed as they burned or threw themselves into the water. Jacaerys directed his mount with skill, swooping low over the waves to target the largest vessels. For a time, it seemed that the dragon might turn the tide. The Velaryon fleet rallied, and the Triarchy began to falter under the onslaught from above. But the battle was not fought only on the water. The Greens had their own dragons, and they had not sent them to the Gullet. Instead, the danger came from different direction. A Triarchy archer, hidden among the chaos of a burning ship, loosed a bolt that struck Vermax in the eye. The dragon roared in agony, twisting and thrashing as it lost control. Jacaerys clung to the saddle, but Vermax plunged into the sea, the weight of the wounded dragon dragging both rider and beast beneath the waves. The prince did not resurface. The loss of Jacaerys was a blow that echoed far beyond the Gullet. He was Rhaenyra's heir, a young man who had been groomed to rule, and his death tore at the heart of the Black cause. The battle itself ended in a strategic victory for the Blacks. The Velaryon fleet, though battered, held the sea, and the Triarchy was forced to withdraw. But the cost was devastating. Another of Rhaenyra's children had been consumed by the war, and the succession that had seemed so clear was now thrown into uncertainty. The Gullet became a graveyard of ships and men, a testament to the war's insatiable hunger. The sea lanes remained contested, but the Blacks had preserved their position, yet the victory felt hollow. The war had claimed another prince, and the Greens had shown that they could strike at Rhaenyra's family, even when they lost the battle. The conflict was no longer just a struggle for the throne. It had become a war of attrition, where every victory came with a price that seemed too high to bear. As the fires on the water faded and the survivors limped back to port, the Blacks were left to reckon with what they had lost. The Dragonseeds had given them new riders, but the war had taken something irreplaceable. The future of the dynasty now rested on younger shoulders, and the path ahead grew darker with every passing day. The war for the sea had ended, but the war for the Iron Throne was far from over. The Riverlands were already burning, and the next blow would fall not on water, but on land, where armies and dragons would clash in a slaughter that would be remembered as the bloodiest of the entire conflict. The Battle of the Gullet had been a storm of fire, war, and when the last Triarchy ship either fled or sank, the sea around Dragonstone fell quiet, but it was a silence filled with wreckage. The immediate threat to the island was broken. The Greens and their sellsword allies had hoped to cut Rhaenyra off from the narrow sea, to starve her out or force her dragons into a trap. Instead, they lost dozens of warships and thousands of men. But the victory came at a cost that would echo through the rest of the war. The Velaryon fleet, the backbone of the Black naval power, was battered and scattered. Ships that had once patrolled the waters in proud lines now drifted as burning hulks or lay splintered against the rocks of the Gullet. Corlys Velaryon, the sea snake, stood on the shore of Dragonstone and watched his life's work bleed into the salt. He had built the greatest fleet in the known world, and now he saw it pay the price of royal ambition. This was not the first time. His grandson Lucerys had died at Storm's End, devoured by Varga. Now another grandson was gone. Jacaerys Velaryon, Rhaenyra's heir, had led the dragon attack from above, diving into the chaos on his dragon Vermax. In the thick of the fighting, something went wrong. Perhaps a crossbow bolt found a weak scale. Perhaps Vermax was simply overwhelmed by the sheer number of enemy ships and archers. The dragon fell into the sea, and Jacaerys with it. His body was never recovered. For the Black Cause, this was a blow far worse than the loss of any ship. Jacaerys had been the future. He was the eldest son, the heir to the Iron Throne, the young prince who had flown across the realm to secure alliances, who had proposed the Dragonseed plan, who had shown the kind of steady leadership that the Blacks desperately needed. Now he was gone, and in the confusion of the battle, another tragedy unfolded. Rhaenyra's younger son, Viserys, had been aboard a ship trying to escape the fighting. The vessel was captured by the Triarchy, and in the chaos, the boy vanished. For months, the Blacks would believe him dead, drowned or killed in the melee. In truth, he had been taken prisoner, spirited away to Lys, but that knowledge would not reach his mother for a long time. She lost 2 sons in one day, though only one death was certain. The Gullet had achieved its strategic purpose. Dragonstone was safe for now. The Greens could not blockade the island, and Rhaenyra could still receive supplies and reinforcements from the sea. But the price of that safety was staggering. The Velaryon fleet would never again be the dominant force it once was. Corlys had lost his heir, his grandson, and the future of his house, and Rhaenyra had lost the son who gave the Black Cause much of its hope. The war would continue, but the shape of it had changed. The Blacks still held the advantage in dragons, but their succession was now uncertain. The Greens, for all their losses, had dealt a wound that would fester. In the weeks that followed, the focus of the war shifted inland. The Riverlands had become a charnel house, with armies marching and counter-marching, and the Greens under Aemon's regency were determined to crush the Black loyalists there. The sea battle was over, but the war on land was about to grow even bloodier, and so the war turned its gaze away from the salt and the spray, away from the burning hulls and the drowned princes, and fixed itself upon the rivers and fields of the Riverlands. The news of Jacaerys' death reached King's Landing before it reached Rhaenyra herself, carried by ravens that flew faster than any dragon. In the Red Keep, the Greens received the tidings with a mixture of relief and grim satisfaction. Aegon II, still recovering from his injuries at Rook's Rest, was said to have smiled when he heard the report. Aemond, now firmly established as regent and protector of the realm, saw the opportunity to press the advantage. The Blacks had lost their heir, and with him, the line of succession that had seemed so certain only months before. Rhaenyra's claim had always rested on the naming of her as heir by her father, but the strength of her cause had been bolstered by the promise of a strong, capable prince to follow her. Now that promise lay at the bottom of the Gullet. The Riverlands had become a grinding war of attrition. Lord Grover Tully, the aged Lord Paramount of the Trident, had died of natural causes, and his grandson and heir, Sir Elmo Tully, had declared for the Blacks. But the Greens had not surrendered the region without a fight. Aemond, riding Varga, the largest and most fearsome dragon in the world, had taken to the skies over the Riverlands with a brutal purpose. He burned villages, destroyed crops, and slaughtered livestock, seeking to starve the Black loyalists into submission. The Lannister army, under Lord Jason Lannister, marched from the west, while the Baratheon forces under Lord Boros Baratheon advanced from the south. The Riverlands, already a patchwork of feuding houses and contested lands, became a battlefield where no one was safe. In the midst of this chaos, a new figure emerged from the shadows of the war. Daemon Targaryen, Rhaenyra's husband and the rogue prince, had been absent from the Battle of the Gullet. Some said he was in the Riverlands, rallying the Black forces. Others whispered that he was on a secret mission, one that would change the course of the war. Daemon had always been a creature of impulse and ambition, but he was also a strategist of rare cunning. He knew that the Greens had the advantage in numbers and resources, but the Blacks had the dragons, and dragons, if used wisely, could turn the tide of any battle. But the loss of Jacaerys had shaken the Black cause to its core. Rhaenyra, grieving and isolated on Dragonstone, began to withdraw from the decisions of war. She relied more heavily on her council, on Corlys Velaryon, on the few loyal lords who remained. But the sea snake himself was a broken man, his fleet in ruins, his grandsons dead or missing. The alliance that had sustained the Blacks for so long was beginning to fray. The Dragonseeds, the bastards of Targaryen blood, who had claimed dragons in the desperate days before the Gullet, now became a source of both strength and tension. Adam of Hull, the son of Corlys Velaryon's natural daughter, had claimed Seasmoke, the dragon once ridden by Laenor Velaryon. Hugh Hammer had claimed Vermithor, the great bronze beast that had once belonged to King Jaehaerys I. Ulf the White had mounted Silverwing, the dragon of Queen Alizanne, and Nettles, a wild girl of uncertain lineage, had tamed Sheepstealer, a dragon that had long eluded all attempts at capture. These new riders gave the Blacks a formidable aerial force, but they were not nobles, they were commoners, and they knew it. Their loyalty was to the promise of reward, to the dream of land and titles, not to the cause of Rhaenyra's succession. And in the weeks after the Gullet, as the war ground on, their patience began to wear thin. The Greens, for their part, were not idle. Aemond had dispatched Criston Cole, the Lord Commander of the Kingsguard, to lead the army in the Riverlands. Cole was a skilled commander, but he was also a man driven by hatred for Rhaenyra and all she represented. His campaign was ruthless, but it was also methodical. He avoided direct confrontation with the larger Black Dragon force, instead striking at supply lines, burning castles, and forcing the Black Lords to choose between surrender and starvation. The Riverlands bled, and the blood stained the trident red, and so the war continued, a dance of fire and shadow, of grief and ambition. The Battle of the Gullet had been a victory, but it was a victory that tasted of ash. The Blacks had held Dragonstone, but they had lost the future. The Greens had failed to break the blockade, but they had struck a blow that would echo through the generations. And in the halls of Dragonstone, in the chambers of the Red Keep, and in the fields of the Riverlands, the players of this Game of Thrones prepared for the next move, knowing that the board was now set for a final, terrible reckoning. While the war at sea had brought the Blacks a fragile reprieve, the war on land was about to reach its most desperate and bloodiest chapter yet. The Riverlands, already scarred by the first clashes of the succession crisis, now became the stage for a conventional battle of a scale and ferocity that the realm had not seen in generations. This was not a dragon duel in the sky, nor a raid on a coastal fortress. This was thousands of men, knee-deep in freezing mud, hacking each other to pieces until the water ran red. In the Riverlands, Jason Lannister leads a powerful green host toward the Red Fork. He was the Lord of Casterly Rock, a man of considerable pride, and, as events would prove, considerably less tactical sense. His army was a splendid thing to behold on the march, a column of crimson and gold stretching for miles, bristling with the finest steel that Lannister gold could buy. He had been ordered to march east, to link up with other green forces and crush the Black resistance in the Riverlands once and for all. But the Riverlands were not the Westerlands. The land was flat, cut by 1,000 streams and rivers, and the people were stubborn. The Black forces, however, were not caught unprepared. They gathered along the Lakeshore, using broken ground, local knowledge, and sheer desperation to stop him. The command fell to a man named Lord Petter Piper, a veteran of countless border skirmishes, and Sir Garibold Grey, a knight of the Kingsguard who had been dispatched by Rhaenyra herself. They had no dragons. They had no great cavalry host. What they had was a deep understanding of the terrain, and a grim determination to make the Lannisters bleed for every inch of muddy ground they took. The two armies met on the shores of a great lake, a body of water that would soon be remembered for its terrible feast. The battle became known as the Fishfeed, a massive slaughter fought in mud, water and winter cold. The name came from the aftermath, when the lake's surface was choked with so many corpses that the fish grew fat and sluggish for years to come. But the name also captured the nature of the fighting itself. It was not a battle of clever maneuvers or decisive charges. It was a feeding frenzy of violence, a chaotic, grinding struggle where formations dissolved into knots of men slipping and dying in the slime. The Lannisters tried to use their superior numbers and heavy cavalry to break the Black Line, but the ground was against them. The Lakeshore was a quagmire of soft earth and reeds, and the horses could not gain any speed. The black archers, hidden in the tall grass and behind the low hills, poured volley after volley into the advancing ranks. And when the two sides finally met, it was with a sound that veterans would later describe as a wet, sickening crunch, the sound of thousands of men colliding in the mud. The Lannister host is shattered, proving that Dragon War has not ended the old terror of massed infantry combat. This was the crucial lesson of the Fishfeed. The dance of the dragons had become so defined by the aerial duels, the fiery sieges, and the terror of dragonfire that many had forgotten the brutal arithmetic of a shield wall. Jason Lannister had assumed that his well-equipped army would simply overwhelm the ragged black defenders. He was wrong. The black soldiers, many of them river lords and small folk, who had lost everything to the war, fought with a desperation that no amount of Lannister gold could match. They knew that if they broke, there was nowhere to run. The lake was at their backs. The fighting lasted from dawn until dusk, and then continued into the night by the light of burning tents and the pale moon. Men drowned in water shallow enough to stand in, pulled down by the weight of their armour and the press of the dying. The Lannister centre finally collapsed when Lord Piper led a desperate countercharge straight into the enemy command post. Jason Lannister himself was captured, dragged from his horse and taken in chains, with their lord lost and their line shattered. The Green Army dissolved into a fleeing mob, hunted through the marshes for days afterward. The Fishfeed was a victory for the Blacks, but it was a victory that tasted of ash. Thousands lay dead on that lakeshore, and the stench of decay hung over the Riverlands for weeks. It proved that even without dragons, the war could still produce horrors on a scale that shocked the realm. It also proved that the Greens could be beaten on the ground, that their alliances and their gold were not enough to guarantee victory. But the cost of that proof was measured in the lives of common men, men whose names would never be sung, whose bones would feed the fish of that lake for a generation. And as the survivors limped away from that field of slaughter, the war in the Riverlands was far from over. The Green cause had suffered a grievous wound, but it was not yet dead, and in the skies above, the great dragons still flew, their riders already planning the next move, in a game that would not end until the very foundations of the Targaryen dynasty had been shaken to dust. I hope you're as amazed by this as I am. If you want to stay updated on more content like this, make sure to subscribe and join a community of curious minds. Trust me, what's coming next will challenge everything you thought you knew. The Fishfeed at the Lakeshore had been a slaughter, a day-long butchery that turned the waters red and left thousands of Lannister men dead in the mud. Jason Lannister himself had fallen, his host shattered, and the Riverlands had tasted the first true victory for the Blacks in that theatre of war. But the war was far from over, and the man who had orchestrated so much of the Green cause was still alive, still commanding, still dangerous. Criston Cole, the Kingmaker, the man who had crowned Aegon II and set the realm ablaze, now found himself leading the remnants of a broken army through the Riverlands. He had marched south from Harrenhal with a force of several thousand men, hoping to link up with other Green loyalists, or perhaps reach the safety of King's Landing. But the Riverlands had turned against him. The small folk, the river lords, the scattered remnants of black forces. They all seemed to know where he was, and they all seemed eager to see him dead. The hunt began slowly. Cole's army moved through the countryside, but they were shadowed at every turn. Scouts reported enemy movements on all sides. Villages that might have offered supplies were empty or hostile. The rivers, which might have provided a route of escape, were watched by black-aligned men. Cole's men grew tired, hungry, and fearful. They were not an army anymore. They were a herd being driven toward a killing ground. The men who hunted Cole were not the great lords of the Blacks, not the dragon riders or the high commanders. They were men like Lord Forrest Frey, Lord Roland Dowery, and Lord Samwell Blackwood, river lords who had suffered under the Green occupation and who wanted vengeance. They did not want a battle. They wanted a butcher's ball, a slow, grinding destruction of the enemy force, without the honour of a proper field engagement. Cole's army was forced to march through the rain, through the mud, through the endless fields and forests of the Riverlands. They were harried by skirmishers, attacked at night, denied rest. Men began to desert. Supplies ran low, the horses grew weak, and all the while the net tightened. Finally, near a place called the Mander's Ford, the trap was sprung. The black forces had gathered in overwhelming numbers. Cole's army was surrounded, outnumbered perhaps 3 or 4 to 1. There was no escape, no relief column coming, no dragon to save them. The Kingmaker had come to the end of his road. Criston Cole was a knight of the Kingsguard, a man who had sworn vows of honour and duty. He had broken those vows when he helped crown Aegon over Rhaenyra, but he still believed in the old ways of chivalry. He asked for what any knight would ask for in such a situation: the right to die with a sword in his hand. He wanted a single combat, a duel, a chance to meet his end as a warrior, not as a trapped animal. The men who surrounded him refused. They had no interest in granting him a noble death. They had seen what his war had done to the Riverlands. The burned villages, the murdered small folk, the fields left to rot. They had lost brothers and fathers and sons to his campaigns. They did not want to give him the honour of a clean death. Instead, they ordered the archers forward. Scores of bowmen lined the ridges and the tree line. Arrows knocked and aimed. Cole stood there, alone, his white cloak still visible among the mud and the blood of his dying army. He drew his sword anyway, perhaps hoping for a miracle, perhaps simply refusing to die on his knees. The arrows flew. They came in a dark cloud, a hissing rain of death that struck him from all sides. He fell, pierced by a dozen shafts, his sword still in his hand, but never having struck a single blow. The Kingmaker was dead, cut down by common archers who denied him even the final dignity of a warrior's end. The death of Criston Cole was a significant moment in the war. He had been the architect of the Green cause, the man who had convinced Aegon to take the crown, the commander who had led the army through the early victories. He had been called the Kingmaker for a reason, but his death did not end the war. It did not bring peace to the Riverlands. It did not even bring a decisive advantage to the Blacks. What it did was strip the Green cause of its most capable military leader. Without Cole, the Greens would have to rely on men like Lord Ormond Hightower and Sir Gawain Hightower, men who were competent but not brilliant. The war would continue, but it would become a different kind of conflict, more desperate, more brutal, more driven by the whims of dragon riders than the strategies of generals. The Butcher's Ball, as the small folk would come to call it, was a grim reminder of how the war had changed. The old rules of chivalry, the codes of honour that had once governed warfare in Westeros, were being abandoned. Men were no longer fighting for glory or for a cause. They were fighting for survival, and they would use any means necessary to destroy their enemies. Cole's body was stripped of his white cloak and his armour, left to rot in the mud. His head was sent to King's Landing as a trophy, a message to the Greens that their champion had fallen, but the message was not as clear as the Blacks might have hoped. Aegon II, still crippled and hiding in the Red Keep, did not surrender. Aemond One Eye riding Varga did not retreat. The war would go on, and the Riverlands would continue to burn. The hunt for coal had been a brutal, grinding affair, but it was only one part of a larger pattern. The war in the Riverlands was far from over. The Blacks had won a victory, but they had not won the war, and the man who had once crowned a king was now just another corpse in a land that had become a graveyard. The butcher's ball was over, but the dance was still playing out, and the next steps would be taken in the shadow of dragons. The butcher's ball had left the Greens without their Lord Commander, and the news of Criston Cole's death spread through the Riverlands like a chill wind. But the war did not pause for mourning. If anything, the loss only sharpened the fury of those who remained loyal to King Aegon II. And no one felt that fury more keenly than Prince Aemond Targaryen, the one-eyed rider of Vhagar. Aemond had spent the early months of the war in the Crownlands and the Reach, but the string of green defeats in the Riverlands demanded a response. He could not allow the Blacks to consolidate their gains, could not let them believe that the war was turning in their favour, and so he mounted the largest dragon in the world and turned Vhagar's shadow eastward toward the heart of the Riverlands. What followed was not a battle in the traditional sense. There were no lines of infantry, no cavalry charges, no siege towers creeping toward castle walls. Aemond's campaign was something far more terrible, because it was a war fought not against armies, but against the land itself. The Riverlands had always been a patchwork of loyalties, with houses that had sworn to Rhaenyra and houses that had bent the knee to Aegon. But Aemond did not trouble himself with such distinctions. He flew over villages that had sent men to the Black Host, and he burned them. He descended upon castles whose lords had declared for the Princess of Dragonstone, and he reduced their towers to rubble. He set fire to fields of ripe grain, to storehouses packed with winter provisions, to mills and granaries, and everything that sustained life in that green and fertile region. Vhagar had always been a weapon of conquest, a dragon that had carried Visenya through the conquest of the Seven Kingdoms and had served the crown for nearly a century. But under Aemond, she became something else. She became a moving instrument of punishment, a creature whose purpose was not to capture territory, but to deny it to the enemy. Aemond understood that he could not hold every village he burned, could not garrison every castle he cracked open, but he could make those lands worthless to the Blacks. He could turn the Riverlands into a wasteland where no army could march, where no harvest could be gathered, where no lord could feel safe in his own hall. Villages, castles, crops and civilians became targets because armies were increasingly difficult to find. The Blacks had learned from the Butcher's Ball, had learned that meeting the Greens in open battle was a gamble they did not need to take. They scattered their forces, hid behind walls, refused to give Aemond the pitched engagement he craved, and so he took his frustration out on the land itself. The smoke from Aemond's raids could be seen for miles. Entire valleys filled with the haze of burning timber and thatch. The rivers ran black with ash. Farmers abandoned their fields. Shepherds drove their flocks into the hills, and the roads filled with refugees carrying whatever they could salvage. The Riverlands, which had already suffered through the early battles of the war, now endured a second and more intimate terror. Aemond did not fly alone. He was accompanied by a small retinue of knights and men-at-arms who followed on horseback, securing the ruins of what he left behind. But the real work was done from the saddle of Vhagar, and it was done with a cold precision that shocked even those who had grown accustomed to the horrors of war. There were stories, of course. There always are. Men spoke of a village where the prince landed in the square and demanded to know which houses had sent Susan to fight for Rhaenyra. When no one answered, he set fire to the sept and the inn and the mill, and then he mounted Vhagar and burned the rest from the air. Women and children fled into the woods, but the dragon's fire found them in the thickets. The village was erased from the map, its name forgotten, its people reduced to bones in a field of ash. Other stories told of a castle whose lord had declared for the Blacks but had died at the Fishfeed. His widow refused to surrender, believing that the walls would hold. Aemond circled the castle 3 times, and on the 3rd pass, Vhagar's flames licked the battlements and turned the stone to cracked and blackened ruin. The widow survived, but her sons did not. She was left to rule over a tomb. Aemond's destruction weakened the Blacks. There is no doubt of that. He denied them the resources of the Riverlands, forced them to divert men and supplies to protect what remained, and made it clear that no corner of the realm was safe from the reach of Vhagar. But the cost of that campaign was not borne by the Blacks alone. The Riverlands had always been a fractious and independent region, a place where the memory of ancient wrongs ran deep. Aemond's terror did not unite the Riverlords behind the Green cause. It did not inspire loyalty or fear in the way that a conqueror might hope. Instead, it left the realm poorer, angrier, and harder for anyone to rule. The small folk who survived the fires did not forget who had burned their homes. They did not care whether the dragon that had killed their families was ridden by a prince of the Greens or a prince of the Blacks. They only knew that the Targaryens had brought fire and death to their doorsteps, and that resentment would fester long after the war was over. And yet, for all the destruction he wrought, Aemond did not achieve his primary goal. He did not draw the Black Army into a decisive engagement. He did not break their will to fight. The Blacks remained in their strongholds, waiting, watching, and planning. The Riverlands were a ruin, but the war was not won. As the weeks passed, Aemond's raids grew more sporadic, more desperate. He flew from one end of the Riverlands to the other, searching for a target worthy of his dragon's fury. But the armies had vanished, the castles had closed their gates, and the land had become a graveyard of ash and silence. Even Vhagar, ancient and terrible as she was, could not fight a ghost. The prince grew restless. He had come to the Riverlands to avenge the Greens, to punish the Blacks, to prove that the war was not lost. But the war had changed, and Aemond had not changed with it. He was still the one-eyed prince, still the rider of the largest dragon in the world, still the most feared man in the 7 kingdoms. But fear alone does not win wars, and destruction alone does not bring victory. And so the campaign that had begun with fire and fury ended in a kind of weary stalemate. Aemond returned to Harrenhal, the cursed castle that had become his base of operations, and there he brooded. The Riverlands were broken, but the Blacks were not. The war would continue, and the next phase would be fought not in the fields and villages of the Riverlands, but in the skies above the God's Eye, where the fate of the realm would be decided by the clash of dragons. While Aemond, One Eye and Vhagar were turning the Riverlands into a blackened wasteland, burning villages and castles that could not possibly threaten him, the war was moving in a direction he had not anticipated. The Green strategy had always relied on a simple principle: hold the capital, control the throne, and let the legitimacy of the crown wear down the rebellion. But by the time Aemond finished his first great sweep of the Riverlands, that strategy was in ruins. The armies that were supposed to defend King's Landing had been scattered at the Fishfeed, hunted down at the Butcher's Ball, or were too far away to matter. The city that Aegon II had been crowned in was, for the first time since the war began, truly vulnerable. The Blacks saw the opening with a clarity that had eluded them for months. Daemon Targaryen, still at Harrenhal, began sending riders south. Messages flew between the castle on the lake and Dragonstone, between Dragonstone and Driftmark. The plan was not complicated, but it required timing. Corlys Velaryon would gather what remained of his fleet, the ships that had survived the Gullet and the long months of blockade duty, and sail them up the Blackwater. They would not need to fight their way into the harbour, not if the city was already in chaos. And chaos was exactly what Daemon intended to deliver. The taking of King's Landing was not a battle in the traditional sense. There was no clash of armies on a field, no dragon dueling dragon in the sky. Instead, it was a quiet unravelling, a slow collapse of will that began the moment the city's defenders realised they were alone. The Gold Cloaks, the City Watch, that had once been commanded by Daemon himself, had been depleted by years of war and neglect. The lords who had sworn to defend the capital had marched north with Criston coal, or east with the fleet, and most of them were dead. The gates were still manned, the walls still patrolled, but the men behind them knew the truth. There was no army coming to save them. Aemond was somewhere in the Riverlands, burning farms. The Triarchy had been broken at the Gullet, and the Velaryon sails were visible on the horizon. Corlys Velaryon's fleet did not need to fire a single shot in anger. The sight of the ships, their hulls dark against the water, their sails bearing the seahorse of House Velaryon, was enough. The harbour masters threw open the chains. The dock workers stepped aside. The ships glided into port as if they were arriving for a trade negotiation, not a conquest. And behind them, moving through the streets that had once cheered for Aegon II, came the men who had been waiting for this moment. Simon Strong, the son of Lord Strong, led a contingent of men through the river gate. Lord Darklyn, whose lands had been ravaged by the Greens, marched from the north, and from within the city itself, from the alleys and the brothels and the taverns where the small folk nursed their grievances, came the whisper that the Queen was coming. Rhaenyra Targaryen entered King's Landing, not as a conqueror, but as a returning sovereign. She rode through the gates on a white horse, her dragon Syrax circling overhead, her banners unfurled in the wind. The streets were lined with people, but the mood was not one of celebration. It was something more cautious, more watchful. These were the same people who had cheered for Aegon II when he was crowned. They had thrown mud at Rhaenyra's messengers. They had watched her son die at Storm's End, her stepson die at the Gullet, and her husband burn the Riverlands from the back of a dragon that was not hers. They did not know what to expect from a queen who had lost so much, and Rhaenyra, for her part, did not know what to expect from them. She made her way to the Red Keep, the castle that had been her father's, the castle that should have been hers from the beginning. The gates were opened without resistance. The guards who had served the Greens laid down their spears. The servants who addressed Aegon II and prepared his meals and swept his floors now bowed to a new master. Rhaenyra walked through the halls she had known as a child, past the tapestries and the portraits and the iron chandeliers, until she reached the throne room. And there it was, the Iron Throne, 1,000 swords forged into a single seat, the symbol of everything she had fought for. She climbed the steps slowly. The blades were sharp, and she had heard the stories of kings who had cut themselves on their own throne. She did not care. She sat down, and for a moment she was Queen of the Seven Kingdoms. The conquest was complete. The city was hers. The throne was hers. The war, it seemed, was over. But the Iron Throne has never been kind to those who sit on it. Rhaenyra would learn that lesson faster than most. The city she had taken was not a prize. It was a trap. The treasury was empty, drained by Aegon II's war efforts and the flight of the Green Loyalists. The small folk were hungry, and they blamed the Queen, who had brought war to their doorstep. The lords who had bent the knee did so out of fear, not loyalty, and they would turn on her the moment it suited them. And somewhere in the Riverlands, Aemond One Eye was still alive, still mounted on Vargar, still burning. The taking of King's Landing was a victory, but it was the kind of victory that comes with a price. Rhaenyra had the throne, she had the city, she had the crown, but holding them would require more than dragons and armies. It would require a kind of ruthlessness she had not yet shown, a willingness to shed blood that she had always tried to avoid. And the Iron Throne, as it always does, would demand its due. The war was not over. It was only changing shape. The battles would no longer be fought on open fields or in the waters of the Gullet. They would be fought in the shadows of the Red Keep, in the streets of King's Landing, in the hearts of men who had seen too much death to care who sat on the throne. And the dragons, the magnificent, terrible dragons that had made the Targaryens masters of the world, would soon find that even they could not protect a queen who had lost the trust of her people. The gates of King's Landing swung open without a fight, and Rhaenyra Targaryen entered the city she had been denied for years. The small folk lined the streets, some cheering, many more watching in silence, uncertain what this change of rulers would mean for their daily lives. The siege had ended, and with it the worst of the hunger, but the city's granaries were nearly bare, and the treasury that Aegon II had left behind was, for all practical purposes, empty. Rhaenyra rode through the Dragon Gate on a pale horse, dressed in black and red, her crown resting on her brow. Behind her came Daemon, grim and watchful, and then the Dragonseeds, the lords who had chosen her cause, and the remnants of the army that had marched from Dragonstone. The Red Keep loomed ahead, and the Iron Throne waited. But the throne, she would soon learn, was not a seat of comfort. It was a trap of 1,000 blades, and every sharp edge would cut her. The first problem was food. King's Landing had been under blockade and siege for months, and the countryside around it had been stripped bare by both armies. The city's population, swollen with refugees from the war, numbered somewhere near 500,000 souls, and they all needed to eat. Rhaenyra's advisors told her that the royal granaries held perhaps 2 weeks of grain at most, and that was if rations were cut severely. The treasury, meanwhile, contained less than 10,000 dragons in coin, and much of that was already promised to merchants who had supplied the city during the siege. So the new queen did what rulers have done for centuries when faced with empty coffers and hungry mouths. She raised taxes. She imposed new levies on trade, on property, on the guilds that controlled the city's crafts and commerce. She demanded loans from the wealthy houses of the Reach and the Riverlands, houses that had already bled gold and men for the war, and when the money did not come quickly enough, she sent her men to seize what she needed. The arrests began quietly at first. A merchant here, a goldsmith there, men accused of hoarding grain or profiteering during the siege. Some were guilty, many were not. But in a city where rumour spread faster than fire, every arrest became a story of tyranny. The executions followed soon after. Rhaenyra ordered the heads of 12 men displayed on the gates of the city, a warning to those who would defy her. But the small folk did not see a queen enforcing justice. They saw a ruler who had promised peace and brought only more suffering. The relief that had greeted Rhaenyra's arrival curdled into resentment within a matter of weeks. The people remembered that it was the Greens who had starved them during the siege. But they also remembered that it was the Blacks who had blockaded the city from the sea. Now with Rhaenyra on the throne, the shortages continued. Bread prices did not fall. The markets remained thin, and every night, in the taverns and the alleys, voices whispered that the new queen was no better than the old king. Rhaenyra's council was as divided as the city itself. Corlys Velaryon, the sea snake, urged caution and patience. He had seen what happened when rulers moved too quickly against their own people. But Daemon Ever the Hawk argued for strength. He wanted to crush dissent before it could grow, to make examples of those who spoke against the queen. And then there were the Dragonseeds, Hugh Hammer and Ulf White, who had been given lands and titles, but who chafed at the restrictions placed on them. They had dragons, and they wanted to use them. Rhaenyra tried to balance these competing voices, but the Iron Throne did not lend itself to balance. Every decision she made seemed to anger someone. When she lowered taxes on the poor, the merchants protested. When she raised them on the wealthy, the lords complained. When she pardoned a green loyalist who swore fealty, her own supporters cried betrayal. When she executed a man for treason, the city whispered that she was as bloodthirsty as Maegor the Cruel. The captured city became a trap, and Rhaenyra was caught in its jaws. Every shortage of grain, every rise in prices, every death in the streets was blamed on her. The Greens had fled. Their agents remained, spreading rumours that Aegon II was still alive, that he would return with an army from the Reach, that Rhaenyra's reign was a temporary thing, and the people, tired of war and hungry for hope, began to believe. Even while she sat the Iron Throne, Rhaenyra's war was slipping beyond her control. The realm she had claimed was not a kingdom to be ruled, but a battlefield to be survived, and the battles were not over. Far to the north, in the Riverlands, Aemond One Eye still rode Vargar, burning villages and castles, refusing to acknowledge the new queen. In the Reach, the Hightower armies were regrouping, gathering strength for a counterstroke, and in the city around her, the small folk sharpened their knives and watched the Red Keep with eyes that held no love. Rhaenyra had won the throne, but she had not won the war, and the throne, she was learning, was the most dangerous place of all. Rhaenyra Targaryen sat the Iron Throne at last, but the seat of 1,000 swords offered no comfort. The treasury was empty, the city hungry, and the whispers of her own people grew louder with each new tax and each new execution. She had won King's Landing, but she had not won the war. Far to the south, in the fertile lands of the Reach, the green cause was gathering strength like a storm that had not yet broken. The Reach had always been the breadbasket of the Seven Kingdoms, and now it became the anvil upon which the Greens would forge their counterstroke. Lord Aemond Hightower, uncle to the fallen King Aegon II, raised a great host from the loyal houses of the south. Beesbury, Costain, Mullendore, and many others answered his call. But it was not only men who marched toward the small market town of Tumbleton. From the dragon pits of the Greens, from the lairs where they had hidden their remaining beasts, came the largest concentration of dragons the war had yet seen. Vermithor, the Bronze Fury, second largest dragon in the realm after Vargar, flew under the command of a new rider. Silverwing, the beautiful she-dragon once ridden by Queen Alizarn, also answered to a new master, and there were others. Thessarion, the Blue Queen, ridden by Prince Darren the Daring, and the wild dragon Sheep-stealer, though his rider was not yet certain. But the two most dangerous dragons in the Green Host were ridden by men who had until recently fought for the Blacks. Hugh Hammer and Ulf White had been Dragonseeds, low-born bastards of Targaryen blood, who had claimed dragons during the chaos of the war. Hugh had mounted Vermithor, Ulf had mounted Silverwing. They had been Rhaenyra's champions, her proof that dragon power could be found anywhere. But power once tasted changes a man. The Greens knew this. They sent riders to Tumbleton with promises that far exceeded anything Rhaenyra could offer. Land, titles, wealth, perhaps even a crown. Hugh Hammer, a blacksmith's bastard, began to dream of a throne. Ulf White, a drunkard and a braggart, saw only gold and glory. The Black Army at Tumbleton was commanded by Lord Mooton and Lord Darklyn, but they had no authority over the dragon riders. Hugh and Ulf camped apart, spoke in whispers and waited. When the Green Host arrived and the battle began, the two Dragonseeds made their choice. In the chaos of the first charge, as Black Knights clashed with Green, Hugh turned Vermithor against his own side. The Bronze Fury descended in a storm of fire, incinerating lines of black soldiers who had trusted him as their ally. Ulf White followed on Silverwing, her silver flames cutting through the ranks of men who had fought beside him only hours before. The betrayal was absolute. The Black Army shattered. Tumbleton fell not to the enemy's steel, but to dragonfire turned inward. What followed was not a battle, but a massacre. The Greens sacked the town, and the dragons did not discriminate between soldiers and civilians. Homes burned, streets ran with blood, and the cries of the dying rose into a sky filled with smoke. Hugh Hammer and Ulf White had sold their loyalty for promises, and Tumbleton paid the price. The first Battle of Tumbleton exposed a truth that Rhaenyra had refused to see. An army built around men who command dragons is only as strong as their loyalty, and loyalty, when it can be bought, is no loyalty at all. The Blacks had lost not only a battle but a fortress, a host, and two of their most powerful weapons. The Greens now held the south, and their dragons were many. The war was far from over, and the next blow would fall not on a battlefield, but on the very heart of the realm. The news of Tumbleton reached King's Landing on the wings of ravens, and with it came a dread that settled over the Red Keep like a shroud. Rhaenyra heard the reports in silence, her face pale, her hands gripping the armrests of the Iron Throne until her knuckles whitened. 2 dragons lost to the enemy, 2 dragon riders who had sworn oaths to her, and a host shattered, its survivors fleeing north, with tales of fire and betrayal. The Queen's council fractured. Some urged her to flee, to retreat to Dragonstone and regroup. Others demanded she unleash Syrax and burn the Green Army before it could march on the capital. But Rhaenyra hesitated. She had seen what happened when dragons fought dragons. She had seen the cost, and in that hesitation, the city turned against her. The small folk of King's Landing had never loved Rhaenyra. They remembered her father's reign, the peace, and plenty of the old king, and they blamed her for the war that had brought hunger and death to their doorsteps. Now, with the news of Tumbleton, the whispers became shouts. Mobs gathered in the streets, calling for the Queen's head, for peace at any price. The gold cloaks could not contain them. And then, in a moment of madness that would echo through history, the people turned on the dragons themselves. The Dragonpit, that great domed temple of Targaryen power, became a tomb. The mob stormed its gates, armed with pitchforks and torches, driven by fear and fury. Within, the remaining dragons of the Blacks, young ones, small ones, dragons without riders, were trapped. Syrax, Rhaenyra's own mount, was not there, but others were. The people surged forward, and the dragons fought back. Fire met fire, but numbers overwhelmed. One by one the dragons fell, their roars silenced under a tide of human rage. The dragon pit burned, its roof collapsing, and the smoke rose over King's Landing like a funeral pyre. Rhaenyra watched from the Red Keep, her heart breaking. She had lost her dragons. She had lost her army. She had lost her city. The next blow had fallen, not on a battlefield, but on the very heart of her power, and it had come from her own people. The Greens would march soon, and she had nothing left to stop them. The war was entering its final, bitter chapter. The previous chapter left us at Tumbleton, where the war's largest concentration of dragons was beginning to form. Hugh Hammer and Ulf White, the Dragonseeds who had turned their cloaks, now sat with the Green Host, tempted by promises of land, titles, and power. But while that storm gathered in the Reach, another storm was brewing in the Riverlands. One that would draw the two most feared men in the realm toward a single fateful meeting. Daemon Targaryen had spent months at Harrenhal. The great cursed castle on the northern shore of the God's Eye had become his base of operations, a place from which he could harry green supply lines and wait. He knew that Aemond One Eye, burning, raiding across the Riverlands with Vargar, would eventually come to face him. Daemon had something Aemond wanted: the castle, the strategic position, and the chance to settle a personal score. So Daemon waited. He did not march, he did not flee. He simply stayed, and he let word spread that he was there, a challenge that Aemon could not ignore. The God's Eye is an ancient lake, vast and deep, its waters dark and still. It sits south of Harrenhal, a natural boundary that has seen centuries of history. On a clear day, you can see the towers of the castle from the lake's northern edge, and it was above these waters that the war's most legendary aerial duel would take place. Aemond came. He had to. His pride, his rage over Lucerys's death, and his desire to prove himself the greatest dragon rider in the world all drove him toward Harrenhal. He mounted Vargar, the largest and oldest living dragon, and flew south. Daemon, mounted on Caraxes, the bloodworm, rose to meet him. The two dragons met in the sky above the God's Eye. Caraxes was smaller than Vargar, but faster and more aggressive. Vhagar was a mountain of scale and flame, slow but devastating. The fight was not a quick one. They circled, they bit, they tore at each other with claws and teeth. Caraxes wrapped his long serpentine body around Vargar's neck, trying to choke the larger beast. Vargar ripped into Caraxes with her talons, opening wounds that bled into the lake below. The two dragons became a tangled mass of fury and fire, spiraling downward. And then Daemon did something that no one expected. As the dragons locked together and began to fall, Daemon leaped from his saddle. He drew Dark Sister, the Valyrian steel that had once belonged to Visenya Targaryen, and he aimed himself at Aemond. In that moment, the wind, the height, the chaos of the fall, none of it mattered. Daemon drove the sword straight into Aemond's blind eye, the sapphire that had been set there after his injury at Storm's End. The blade pierced through the socket and into Aemond's brain. Both dragons crashed into the lake. The waters of the God's Eye swallowed them. Caraxes, mortally wounded, dragged Vhagar down into the depths. Neither dragon surfaced, neither rider returned. Daemon's body was never found, though some say his bones still lie at the bottom of the lake, Dark Sister still in his hand. Aemond's corpse was later recovered, still wearing his sapphire eye, but the prince was dead. The battle above the God's Eye removed the two most feared figures in the war. Daemon Targaryen, the rogue prince, the commander who had captured Harrenhal and taken King's Landing, was gone. Aemond One Eye, the prince who had burned the Riverlands and killed Lucerys, was gone. The war lost its most aggressive champions on both sides. What remained was a conflict that would drag on, but without the same fire. With Daemon dead, Rhaenyra's cause lost its most ruthless defender. With Aemond dead, the Greens lost their most powerful dragon. The balance shifted, but not cleanly. In the Reach, the forces at Tumbleton were still gathering. Hugh Hammer and Ulf White had not yet made their final move, but the war was about to enter its darkest phase, where betrayal and desperation would become the only constants. The news of Daemon's death reached King's Landing before his body ever could. Rhaenyra, already seated on the Iron Throne, felt the realm shift beneath her. She had lost her husband, her most feared commander, and the father of her children, but she could not mourn openly. The crown demanded strength, not tears. In the capital, the mood was turning. The small folk who had once cheered her arrival now grew restless. Food was scarce, gold was running out, and the dragons that had once been symbols of Targaryen power were now seen as beasts of war that brought only destruction. Rhaenyra still had Syrax, her own golden dragon, and her sons Joffrey and Aegon the Younger had their mounts as well. But the loss of Caraxes and the death of Daemon left a void that no dragon could fill. She began to trust fewer and fewer people. Her council, once filled with loyalists, now seemed full of whispers and shadows. She suspected betrayal everywhere, and in many cases, she was right. Meanwhile, at Tumbleton, the green host finally moved. Hugh Hammer and Ulf White, the two Dragonseeds who had turned their cloaks, were given command of the vanguard. They rode Vermithor and Silverwing, two of the largest dragons in the realm. The Green Army marched on King's Landing, and the city's defences crumbled. Rhaenyra's forces were outnumbered, outflanked, and outdragoned. She had no choice but to flee. She escaped the city with her remaining children, flying Syrax toward Dragonstone, hoping to find safety in the fortress where she had been born. But Dragonstone was no longer safe. The castle had been taken by Greens, loyal to Aegon II. Rhaenyra arrived to find the gates closed against her. She tried to land, but archers loosed a volley of arrows. One struck Syrax in the wing. The dragon roared and fell, crashing onto the rocky shore. Rhaenyra survived the fall, but she was captured. The Greens brought her before Aegon II, who had been crippled and scarred in the war, but still clung to his throne. He did not give her a trial. He did not give her a quick death. Instead, he fed her to his dragon, Sunfire. The golden dragon, wounded and half-starved, devoured her in the courtyard of Dragonstone. The realm's first ruling queen was dead, consumed by fire and teeth. But the war did not end there. Rhaenyra's son, Aegon the Younger, still lived. He was held captive in King's Landing, a hostage to ensure the loyalty of the remaining black supporters. And in the north, in the Vale, and in the Riverlands, pockets of resistance still smouldered. The conflict would drag on for months more, grinding down what remained of the noble houses and the dragons alike. The dragons were dying. One by one they fell in battle, or were killed by mobs, or simply vanished. The great beasts that had once ruled the skies were becoming legends before their time. By the end of the war, only a handful remained, and those that survived were young, small, or broken. The age of dragons was ending, and the age of men was beginning, and so the dance of the dragons stumbled toward its final, bitter conclusion. It was a war that had no true winners, only survivors. The Targaryen dynasty would endure, but it would never be the same. The dragons were gone, and with them, the magic that had once made the family seem like gods. What remained was a throne stained with blood, a realm scarred by fire, and a legacy of loss that would echo through the centuries. The duel above the God's Eye ended with both dragons and both riders plunging into the lake, but the war did not pause to mourn, even as Daemon Targaryen and Aemond One-Eye vanished beneath the dark water. The surviving armies of both factions were already moving toward a second convergence at a town that had seen fire once before, Tumbleton. The first battle of Tumbleton had been a disaster for the Blacks. The Dragonseeds Hugh Hammer and Ulf White, men of low birth, who had claimed the dragons Vermithor and Silverwing, betrayed Rhaenyra and joined the Greens. They burned the Black army in the field and handed the town to the enemy. But that victory did not bring unity to the Green cause. The two Turncloaks grew arrogant, demanding lands, titles, and even the crown itself. Hugh Hammer openly declared his intention to claim the Iron Throne. Ulf White drank and boasted, treating the war as a game. The Green commanders, Lord Ormond Hightower and Sir Brynden Hightower, could barely control them. Then word came of the disaster at the God's Eye. The Greens lost their most feared weapon when Aemond and Vargar fell, but the Blacks lost Daemon and Caraxes. Both sides were reeling, but neither could afford to stop. The war had to be finished. The surviving armies converged again at Tumbleton. The Greens held the town with a host of reachmen and the two rogue dragons. The Blacks, desperate to reclaim the strategic position, gathered what strength they had left. Rhaenyra, now ruling from King's Landing but growing paranoid, had grown suspicious of the Velaryons. She distrusted Adam Velaryon, the Dragonseed, who had claimed Seasmoke, because his brother Alyn had been linked to the earlier betrayal of the Dragonseeds. She ordered Adam arrested, but Adam learned of the order and fled, not to join the Greens, but to prove his loyalty in the only way he knew how. He rode to Tumbleton on Seasmoke, alone, choosing loyalty over safety. He arrived as the battle was already beginning. The Second Battle of Tumbleton was not a clean clash of armies. It was a slaughter in the streets, a chaos of dragonfire and steel. The Greens' own dragon riders had become dangerous allies. Hugh Hammer on Vermithor and Ulf White on Silverwing fought for the Greens, but they fought for themselves. They did not coordinate with the ground forces. They flew where they pleased, burning friend and foe alike. Adam Velaryon on Seasmoke engaged them. He was outnumbered, 2 dragons against 1, but he had something the Turncloaks lacked: purpose. He dove at Vermithor, raking the great bronze beast with flame and claw. Hugh Hammer, drunk on power and wine, was slow to react. Seasmoke's fire caught Vermithor's wing, and the 2 dragons tumbled through the sky, locked in a deadly embrace. Meanwhile, Ulf White on Silverwing circled above the burning town, laughing as he set rooftops ablaze. But the ground forces of the Blacks, led by Lord Robert Darklyn and Sir Garibald Grey, pressed into the town. They knew that, if they could kill the dragon riders, the dragons might be left riderless. Archers loosed volleys at Ulf, but dragon scales turned aside most arrows. Yet one lucky shaft found a gap in his armour, piercing his throat. Ulf White fell from Silverwing's saddle, crashing into the flames below. Silverwing, now riderless, flew away from the battle, lost and confused. Vermithor and Seasmoke continued their duel. The 2 dragons crashed into the town square, crushing buildings and scattering soldiers. Hugh Hammer tried to dismount and fight on foot, but Adam Velaryon, bleeding and burned, drew his sword and faced him. The Dragonseed who had betrayed his queen met the Dragonseed who had stayed true. Adam cut Hugh down, but as he did, Vermithor, mad with pain and rage, turned on both men. A blast of dragonfire consumed them. Adam Velaryon died in the same flame that killed Hugh Hammer. Seasmoke, wounded and riderless, crawled away from the wreckage and collapsed. The battle destroyed much of the remaining dragon strength on both sides. Vermithor, the great bronze beast, was so badly injured that he could no longer fly. He crawled into a barn and died there. Silverwing vanished, never to be seen again. Seasmoke perished beside his rider. The Greens lost 2 dragons, but the Blacks lost one of their last loyal riders. The ground battle continued for hours, but neither side could claim victory. The town of Tumbleton was reduced to ash and bone. Thousands of men lay dead. The war had consumed another piece of itself. When the sun rose the next morning, the survivors looked upon a field where no faction was truly victorious. The Blacks had stopped the Green advance, but they had lost Adam Velaryon and Seasmoke. The Greens had held the town, but they had lost their rogue dragons and their best chance to march on King's Landing. Both sides limped away exhausted, knowing that the war was far from over. And in the capital, Rhaenyra heard the news of Adam's death. She had ordered his arrest. She had doubted him. Now he was gone, and with him any hope of reconciling with the Velaryons. The seeds of her own downfall had been sown in the ashes of Tumbleton. The war would not end with a great battle, but with a slow, grinding collapse. The next blow would fall not on a battlefield, but in the streets of King's Landing itself, where the people who had once cheered her arrival now sharpened their knives. The Second Battle of Tumbleton had ended in ruin for both sides. Adam Velaryon had given his life to destroy Vermithor and Silverwing, and the Green's army had shattered in the flames. But the victory brought no relief to King's Landing. Rhaenyra sat the Iron Throne, but the city around her was starving. The treasury was empty, the streets filled with refugees from the Riverlands and the Reach, and the price of bread had climbed beyond what most could pay. The dragons that had once made the Targaryens seem invincible now seemed like monstrous mouths that devoured the city's dwindling supplies. Every day, the people watched Syrax and Tyraxis and the other beasts being fed from the royal granaries, and every day their own children went hungry. The mood in the capital had been turning for months. When Rhaenyra first took the city, the small folk had cheered. They had been tired of Aegon II's neglect, tired of the war that bled the countryside. But the new queen brought taxes, arrests, and executions. She demanded loyalty oaths and confiscated the property of those who had served the Greens. The heads of traitors rotted on spikes above the gates, and the smell of decay mixed with the smoke from the cooking fires that burned less and less often. Prophecy began to spread through the alleys and markets. Some said the dragons were a curse, that the gods had sent them to punish the realm for the sins of the Targaryens. Others whispered that the end of the world was near, that the dragons would turn on their masters and burn the city to ash. The spark came from a riot at a baker's shop. A woman was caught stealing a loaf of bread for her children. The city watch dragged her away, and the crowd that gathered to watch grew into a mob. Stones were thrown. A guardsman fell. Then the mob began to surge through the streets, shouting curses against the queen and her beasts. Someone screamed that the dragons were eating the city's food, that they were the reason the children were dying. The cry spread like wildfire. Kill the dragons, kill the dragons. The mob flooded toward the Dragonpit. That great domed structure on the hill of Rhaenys had housed the Targaryen dragons for generations. It was built to contain them, to keep them safe from the world, and the world safe from them. But the gates were not designed to keep out a desperate crowd. The mob broke through the outer doors with a battering ram made from a cart axle. Inside, the keepers tried to hold them back, but there were too many. The dragons chained beneath the dome heard the noise and began to stir. The first to die was Tyraxis, the young dragon of Prince Joffrey. He was small, barely old enough to fly in battle, and he was chained in a lower chamber. The mob poured in with torches and spears and axes. They hacked at his chains, stabbed at his eyes, and when he opened his mouth to breathe fire, they drove a spear down his throat. Tyraxis thrashed and died in the darkness, and the mob cheered. The noise brought the larger dragons to fury. Dreamfire, the she-dragon who had once belonged to Rhaenyra Targaryen, broke her chains in the main chamber. She rose up, her blue and silver scales gleaming in the torchlight, and she breathed a sheet of flame that turned 100 men to ash. But there were thousands more. They came at her from all sides, climbing the pillars, dropping from the galleries above. They threw nets and ropes. They drove spikes into her wings. They stabbed at her belly with anything sharp they could find. Dreamfire fought for a long time, but in the end she was overwhelmed. She collapsed, and the mob swarmed over her body, cutting and tearing until she was still. The other dragons died one by one. Syrax, Rhaenyra's own dragon, was not in the pit at first. She had been loose in the city, but when she heard the screams of the dying dragons, she flew to the dome and tried to force her way inside. The mob saw her coming. They dragged her down with hooks and ropes, and they killed her on the steps of the Dragonpit. The Queen's dragon, the symbol of her power, was butchered by the people she had tried to rule. The slaughter went on for hours. Thousands of small folk died in the struggle, crushed by falling stone, burned by dragonfire, trampled by the panicking crowd. But the dragons died too. When the sun rose the next morning, the Dragonpit was a smoking ruin. The bodies of 5 dragons lay beneath the shattered dome. Only one dragon in King's Landing survived. The young dragon Morning, who was still too small to be kept in the pit and was hidden away by her keeper, but the rest were gone. The destruction of the Dragonpit revealed the final collapse of royal terror. The people of the capital had learned that dragons could die. They had learned that the creatures that had made the Targaryens seem like gods could be brought down by ordinary men with spears and hatred. The crown's power had rested on the backs of those beasts, and now the backs were broken. Rhaenyra fled the city soon after. Her rule in King's Landing ended not by an army, but by a mob of starving citizens. The war would continue, but the age of dragons was already fading. What remained of the Targaryen dynasty would have to find a new way to rule or perish. The mob that stormed the Dragonpit did not stop with the dragons. They surged through the streets of King's Landing, hunting any Targaryen they could find, any dragon rider, any symbol of the dynasty that had let the city starve. Rhaenyra had watched from the Red Keep as her power crumbled in a single afternoon. The dragons that had made her claim possible were dead. Syrax, her own mount, had been torn apart by the crowd. The dragon keepers were slaughtered. The great beasts that had once ruled the skies of Westeros were reduced to bones and ash, and the queen who had sat the Iron Throne for barely half a year knew she could not stay. She fled King's Landing by a hidden passage, accompanied by a handful of loyal guards and her youngest son, Aegon the Younger. They made for the coast, hoping to find a ship that would carry them across the narrow sea. The Dragonstone, the ancient fortress of House Targaryen, the place where she had been born and where she had once felt safe. But the realm had turned against her. The lords who had sworn fealty to her cause were dead, captured, or had bent the knee to Aegon II. The treasury was empty. The people hated her, and the Greens, though battered, still had a king. Aegon II had not been idle during the chaos. After the Battle of the God's Eye, after the Second Battle of Tumbleton, after the riots that had consumed the capital, he had gathered what remained of his loyalists and sailed for Dragonstone. The island had been held by Rhaenyra's supporters, but without dragons to defend it, the castle fell quickly. Aegon II took the fortress and waited. He knew that Rhaenyra would come. She had nowhere else to go. So when Rhaenyra's small ship approached the shores of Dragonstone, she saw the banners of the Golden Dragon flying from the battlements. Her own men were gone. The gates were closed, and on the rocky shore waiting for her stood Aegon II, crippled and scarred from the war, but alive. He had been carried to the beach on a litter, his body broken from the fall at Rook's Rest, his face half melted from dragonfire, but he could still speak, he could still command, and he had brought with him the last dragon that still answered to the Greens. Sunfire, the golden beast that had once been his pride. Rhaenyra was taken before her son. Aegon the Younger, a boy of 10, was forced to watch. He had already lost his father, Daemon, in the battle above the God's Eye. He had lost his brothers, Jacaerys and Lucerys, to war and murder. Now he would lose his mother. Aegon II ordered that Rhaenyra be fed to Sunfire. The dragon, though wounded and lame from its own battles, still had hunger, and so the queen, who had been named Heir by Viserys I, the woman who had claimed the Iron Throne and ruled from the Red Keep, was devoured alive in front of her surviving child. The war that had begun with a contested succession ended with a mother's death on the island where she had been born. Aegon II had won. He had reclaimed the throne. He had destroyed his rival, but his victory was hollow. His body was ruined. His family was dead. His dragons were gone, and the realm was exhausted beyond measure. The lords of Westeros had no desire to continue fighting for a king who could barely walk, who had lost every ally of worth, and who ruled over a capital that had burned itself in rage. The Greens themselves were divided. Many had grown tired of Aegon's cruelty and his inability to govern. They saw that the war had accomplished nothing but ruin. Within months of Rhaenyra's death, Aegon II was poisoned. The exact hand that delivered the poison is debated by maesters. Some say it was a loyalist of the Blacks, seeking vengeance. Others claim it was his own council, desperate to end the bloodshed and place a more pliable ruler on the throne. What is certain is that the king died in his bed, in pain, with no dragon to mourn him. His reign had lasted less than 2 years, and it had cost the Targaryen dynasty nearly everything. The throne passed to Rhaenyra's son, Aegon the Younger, who was crowned as Aegon III. He was the boy of 11, hollow-eyed and silent, who had witnessed horrors that would shape the rest of his life. He had seen his mother eaten by a dragon. He had seen his family torn apart by ambition. He had seen the dragons themselves, the symbols of Targaryen power, slaughtered in the streets. And when he sat the Iron Throne, he inherited a kingdom that was broken. The treasury was empty, the castles were burned, the lords were bitter, and the dragons were dying. The last dragons of House Targaryen would not survive much longer. They grew smaller, weaker, sickly. Some hatched deformed, others died in their eggs. The Dance of the Dragons had not only killed the riders, it had killed the bond between dragon and Targaryen. The age of fire and blood was over. What remained was a boy king, a grieving realm, and the ashes of a war that had consumed everything it touched.